Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The line between the dream and the waking world had always been a sharp one for me. A clean cut made by the scent of coffee or the alarm's digital shriek. But that morning, it blurred. I surfaced from a dream of drowning in warm, dark water to find the room still dark, the silence thick as wool in my ears. There was no transition, no gentle drift. One moment, I was submerged in the dream. The next, I was staring at the faint gray outline of the window, unsure if my eyes were open or closed. The memory of water so real I could still feel its weight on my chest. The divide had softened, become permeable, and something of the nightmare had seeped through. The room was cold. The heavy quilt was a mountain range over my body, but my arms, left outside the covers, were prickled with gooseflesh. I reached for Gavin's warmth and found only cold linen. This was not unusual. He was an early riser, a conqueror of mornings, while I clung to the last shreds of sleep like a life raft. I listened. The old cabin, a wedding gift from his grandfather, was a symphony of sighs and creaks, but beneath that, I could hear him. The soft clink of a ceramic mug, the purposeful tread of his boots on the pine floorboards downstairs. The sounds were an anchor, tethering me to the real, to the normal. We were here for a long weekend to disconnect, he said. To reconnect, I hope. I pushed myself up, the wood floor icy against my bare feet. The window showed a world still asleep, the pine forest a wall of black against a bruised pre-dawn sky. I pulled on his discarded flannel shirt, the one that smelled of pine sap and his cologne, and went downstairs. He was at the small kitchen table, a map spread before him, 2 mugs of steam rising beside it. He looked up, and his smile was a quick, bright thing, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. They were the color of the lake on a cloudy day, and just as unreadable. "Morning, sleepyhead," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Coffee's ready." And the same, steady. "I had a bad dream," I said, the confession feeling childish. I wrapped the flannel tighter around myself. "The water again." He didn't look up from the map, his finger tracing a path along a ridge I didn't recognize. "How did you know?" "You talk in your sleep, Holly. Always have." He finally looked at me, and the smile was back. Softer this time. "Come on, drink your coffee. I have a surprise for you." The surprise was a game. Gavin loved games. Charades on Christmas, complicated betting pools during football season, escape rooms for our anniversary. He loved the structure, the rules, the delicious tension of competition. This one, he explained, was called Survival, a trust exercise. He'd read about it. "It's simple," he said, his voice taking on that lecturing tone he used when he was most excited about an idea. "We simulate a scenario, a home invasion maybe, or taken hostage by radicals in the wilderness. The point is, one of us is restrained, and the other has to find the key. It tests our resolve, our ingenuity, our trust." A cold knot tightened in my stomach. "Restrained how?" He produced them from his pocket then, the steel gleaming dully in the kitchen light. "Handcuffs. Not the fuzzy novelty kind from a party store, but serious, heavy-duty police-issue cuffs." "Where did you get those?" My voice was a whisper. "A guy at work collects historical law enforcement gear. He lent them to me." He jangled them, a short metallic sound that seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. Don't look so scared, Holly. It's pretend. I'll cuff you to the bedpost. I'll hide the key somewhere in the cabin. You have to talk me into giving you clues, or you have to figure out how to get free yourself. It's about communication under pressure. It sounded insane. It sounded like one of his worst ideas, and he'd had a few. But there was a feverish light in his eyes, a need for this that I didn't understand. To deny him felt like a failure. It was always like this. His enthusiasms were tidal forces, and I was a sandcastle on the shore. I don't know, Gavin. It seems dangerous. That's the point, he said, moving behind me, his hands on my shoulders, needing the tension. To push past the comfortable, to see what we're really made of. Don't you want to know what you're capable of? I didn't. I was afraid of what I was capable of the dark, cold thoughts that sometimes swam up from the depths of me. Thoughts that had nothing to do with dream lakes, and everything to do with the quiet desperation of a life lived in his shadow. But I said yes. I always said yes. Upstairs, the bedroom felt smaller, the logs of the walls pressing in. The iron bed frame, an antique he'd insisted on keeping, was solid and unyielding. He had me sit on the edge of the bed, the wood cold through my thin pajama pants. He was gentle, almost clinical, as he clicked the first cuff around my right wrist. It was cold, a band of winter against my skin. He looped the chain through the intricate scrollwork of the bedpost and snapped the second cuff shut. The sound was final. A lock clicking in a vault door. Comfortable? He asked. No. Good. Discomfort is the first step to growth. He kissed my forehead, a dry, dismissive gesture. Now, I'm going to hide the key. I'll be back in 5 minutes. Your job is to get me to tell you where it is. Use your wits. Use your charm. He winked, a grotesque parody of playfulness, and left the room. I heard his footsteps descend the stairs. Then, silence. I tested the cuff immediately. I pulled, my arm a taut cable, my muscles straining. The bed frame groaned, but it didn't give. The metal bit into the delicate bones of my wrist. I twisted my hand, trying to slip it through, but the fit was perfect, engineered for exactly this purpose. To hold. Panic, a quick and fluttering bird, beat its wings against my ribs. This was stupid. This was a game. He would be back. He was probably standing just outside the door, listening, smiling at my struggle. Gavin, I called out, my voice too high, too thin. Okay, you got me. I'm properly intimidated. Where's the key? Silence. A deep, listening silence. The cabin was no longer sighing. It was holding its breath. Gavin, this isn't funny anymore. Come back. Nothing. The only sound was the frantic thudding of my own heart. I looked at the window. The sky was lightening to a pale, sickly gray. A jay screamed somewhere in the forest, a sound like tearing metal. I pulled again, harder this time, putting my whole body into it. A frantic, animal thrashing. The bed slammed against the floorboards, a jarring thunder in the quiet room. Pain shot up my arm, bright and sharp. A thin line of blood welled where the metal had sawed into my skin. Tears of frustration and fear hot in my eyes. This was no longer a game. The line had blurred again, the boundary between his twisted idea of fun and something else, something with sharp teeth and a cold heart. I was trapped, truly, utterly trapped. Hours bled together, marked only by the slow crawl of light across the floorboards. The pale sun rose, casting long, distorted shadows that looked like grasping fingers. My throat was raw from shouting. My bladder was a burning, urgent pressure until I could no longer hold it. The hot shame spreading through my pajamas. The smell sharp and humiliating in the closed room. This was part of it, I realized. This Degradation. Was this what he wanted to see? What I was made of? Piss and tears and terror. The hunger came later, a hollow grinding in my stomach, but the thirst was worse. A desert had taken root in my mouth. My tongue, a swollen piece of leather. My mind began to stutter and skip, the edges of the room softening, the light taking on a watery, unreal quality. And then the memories came, unbidden and unwelcome. I was 7 years old, hiding in the crawl space beneath our old house, the dirt cool and smelling of worms. My father was drunk again, his voice a roaring storm in the kitchen, my mother's a pleading whisper. I had pressed myself into the darkest corner, behind a foundation stone that was always cold and damp, making myself small, so small, trying to become part of the house itself, invisible. The feeling was the same, the trapped, breathless waiting for the danger to pass. Another memory, sharper, more recent. Gavin, just a few months ago, his face calm, his voice measured. You're fragile, Holly. You need looking after. You'd be lost without me. And I had nodded. I had agreed. Because it was easier than fighting. Because a part of me believed it was true. He had been building this cage for years, one considerate bar at a time. The handcuffs were just a formality. The day faded into a deep, blue twilight. The room grew dark. My senses, starved of input, began to turn inward, to invent things. I heard footsteps on the gravel path outside, heavy and deliberate. My heart leapt. Gavin! In here! I'm in here. The footsteps paused right outside the bedroom window. I could see a vague shape, a darkness against the dark. Then they moved on, crunching away into the silence. Not Gavin. A deer, maybe, or my own desperate mind. But the feeling of being watched remained. It thickened in the air, a pressure change before a storm. The darkness in the corner of the room, beyond the dresser, seemed to deepen, to coalesce. It was just a shadow, I told myself, the shape of a chair with a blanket thrown over it. But as I stared, my eyes dry and unblinking, the shadow seemed to breathe. It had a density the other shadows lacked, a presence. It was a hole cut out of the world, a window into nothing. A sound began. So faint I thought it was the ringing in my own ears. A wet, rhythmic sound. A drip, but it was wrong. It was too thick, too organic. It was the sound of something leaking, something that was not water. The shadow in the corner shifted. It didn't move. It poured, flowing from one shape to another, from a tall, slender form to a low, crouching thing. A chill radiated from it, washing over me, raising the hairs on my arms, making my teeth ache. This was no memory. This was no hallucination born of thirst. This was something else. Something that had been waiting in the bones of this old place, in the silence between the trees, and my terror had called to it. A dinner bell ringing in the void. It spoke then, but not in a voice. The words formed directly in my mind, cold and slithering, in a language I had never heard but understood perfectly. It was the sound of roots breaking stone, of ice cracking over deep water. You have been in a small cage, it said, and you have called it a world. I whimpered, pulling against the cuff until the blood flowed fresh, the metallic smell a stark reality in the nightmare. The thing in the corner was a teacher, it explained without moving its non-existent mouth. It had come to show me the true shape of confinement. My body was a cage. My name was a cage. The love I felt for the man who did this was the most exquisite cage of all. It showed me. It peeled back the layers of my reality like skin from a fruit. I saw the infinite howling emptiness between stars, the cold, indifferent machinery of galaxies. I saw my own life as a brief, flickering spark in an ocean of night, and the walls of this cabin, the rules of this world, were nothing but a dream I had agreed to believe in. The horror was not in the monster in the corner. The horror was the universe itself, vast, mindless, and utterly void of the meaning I had so desperately tried to paste onto it. Gavin had not done this to me. He was just a fellow prisoner, rattling his own bars. The real prison was existence. I must have passed out, because the next thing I knew, a sliver of dawn was cutting through the window, and a new sound was carving through the silence. A voice, shouting from outside. "Hello? Is anyone in there?" It was a man's voice, unfamiliar, laced with official concern. Hope, a treacherous and painful emotion, flared in my chest. I tried to call out, but my voice was a ruined croak. I began to kick the bed frame, thumping my heels against the wooden floor, a frantic, clumsy Morse code. The front door splintered open downstairs. Heavy boots pounded up the stairs. The bedroom door flew inward, cracking against the wall. Two men stood there, a sheriff's deputy with a young, grim face, and an older man in a park ranger's jacket. Their flashlights swept the room, blinding me. "Jesus Christ," the deputy breathed. They saw a woman, filthy and bleeding, chained to a bed, sitting in her own waste. They saw a victim. They did not see the teacher. They could not see the vast cosmic truth that had been scoured into my soul. The shadow in the corner was gone, but its lesson remained, etched into the back of my eyes. The ranger rushed forward, his hands gentle as he assessed the cuffs. "It's okay, ma'am. You're safe now. We're going to get you out of here." He spoke into his radio, calling for a bolt cutter, an ambulance. The deputy was looking around the room, his flashlight beam darting into the corners. What happened here? Where is he? I opened my mouth, but the words that came out were not my own. They were the cold, logical conclusion of my education. "He's in the lake." The two men exchanged a glance, a look of pity and horror. They freed me. The sound of the bolt cutter severing the steel chain was the loudest sound I had ever heard. They wrapped me in a foil blanket, its crinkling sound like a swarm of insects. They led me downstairs, my legs buckling, supported by the strong, kind ranger. As we passed through the main room, I saw the map still spread on the table, and beside it, two ceramic mugs. One was empty. The other was still full of cold, untouched coffee. Mind, they led me outside, into the clean, cold morning air. The world was impossibly bright, impossibly detailed. Every needle on the pine trees was a sharp, individual dagger. The sky was a brutal, untroubled blue. They put me in the back of the ambulance, and as the paramedic started an IV, I looked past him, through the open doors, toward the deep, placid water of the lake. They found him later that day, just as I said they would. He was floating face down among the reeds, his pockets weighted with stones. There was no note. The official story wrote itself. A troubled man, a marriage in crisis, a bizarre game gone wrong, ending in a fit of remorse and a final desperate act. They asked me, again and again in soft, careful voices, why I thought he was in the lake. I told them I didn't know. It was just a feeling. They nodded. They wrote it down. They saw a woman in shock, a survivor. They were wrong. I am not a survivor. I am a graduate. I live in a small apartment now, in a city that is all noise and light. I have locks on my doors, heavy deadbolts, but they are a formality, a quaint ritual I perform for the benefit of the other prisoners. The real walls are gone. I see the scaffolding of the world, the terrible math behind the face of my kindly neighbor, the silent scream of the atoms in the coffee cup I hold. The universe is a vast, dark, soundless ocean, and we are all at the bottom, handcuffed to the wreckage of our own meaning. And sometimes, in the deep, quiet hours of the night, when the line between this world and the next grows thin and blurred, I hear it. Not a memory, not a hallucination, a reminder. From the kitchen, or the hallway, or sometimes from right beside my bed. A soft, patient, rhythmic sound. The drip, the drip, the drip. It is the sound of a leak that cannot be fixed, a tap that cannot be turned off. It is the sound of the other place bleeding through. I do not get up to check the source anymore. I did, for the first few months. I would pad through the dark apartment, my heart a frantic bird in a cage of bone, and find nothing. A dry sink, a silent dishwasher. The drip would stop the moment I entered the room, only to start again from a new location once I was back in bed. My therapist calls it a somatic auditory hallucination, a post-traumatic echo. She says my mind is trying to process the unprocessable. She is a kind woman, and she is wrong. She's still building her sandcastles, convinced the tide is just a story. I take the pills she gives me. They make the world soft at the edges, a little fuzzy. They blur the sharp, terrifying angles of reality, but they cannot silence the drip. They cannot unteach the lessons I learned in that cabin. Today I went to the grocery store. It is a monumental task, a journey through a landscape of ghosts. The produce section is a riot of color and decay, a million tiny deaths arranged in neat pyramids. I can see the frantic cellular division in the bananas, the slow rot setting in beneath the unblemished skin of the apples. The other shoppers are sleepwalkers, their carts clattering like tumbrils. They argue about coupons and stare at their phones, their faces bathed in the sterile light, unaware that they are already fossils in the making. A man bumped my cart with his. He was tall, with kind eyes, and a harried expression. "So sorry," he said, offering a small, apologetic smile. A normal interaction. A moment of human connection. But I saw it. For a fraction of a second, his face flickered. The skin became translucent, and beneath it was not skull and muscle, but a swirling, formless gray. A nebula of dust and cold fire. It was the truth of him. The man is just a suit the universe is wearing today. I flinched, my cart veering away. His smile faltered, replaced by confusion and a hint of hurt. He moved on, back into the dream. I left my cart in the middle of the aisle, full of food I would never eat, and walked out into the afternoon. The city is the loudest quiet I have ever known. The blare of horns, the shriek of brakes, the chatter of 1,000 conversations. It is all just white noise, a frantic, collective attempt to drown out the real silence. The silence that sits beneath it all, in the spaces between atoms. The silence the drip comes from. I know he is not gone. Gavin? The teacher did not kill him. It simply showed him the same door it showed me. He looked into the abyss, and unlike me, he chose to walk through it. The stones in his pockets were not an act of remorse. They were ballast. He was not trying to sink. He was trying to dive deeper. Sometimes I think I see him. A flicker of his jacket in a crowd. The set of a stranger's shoulders from behind. It is never him, of course. He is elsewhere. He is exploring the vast, dark ocean, free of his cage at last. I am sitting in my apartment now. The sun is setting, painting the walls in shades of orange and purple. A beautiful lie. The drip has started again. It is coming from the hallway tonight. A patient, metronome sound. It does not frighten me anymore. It is a connection, a thread tied to the truth. In a world of pretty illusions, the drip is honest. It is the sound of the void, and it is calling my name. Not Ollie. That name never fit. It is calling the thing I am underneath. The nameless, formless awareness that watched from behind my eyes as a child hiding in a crawlspace. That watched as a woman chained to a bed. That watches now from this small room at the end of the world. I am listening. I am still. And I am waiting to see what I will do next. The waiting is not passive. It is a form of intense concentration, like focusing on a single star in a light-polluted sky. The drip is my star. It is the one true thing in this cacophony of false comforts. The pills my therapist insists on are in the medicine cabinet, a full bottle. I have not taken one in 17 days. The sharp edges of reality are returning, and while they cut, the pain is a welcome confirmation that I am still capable of feeling something real. Last night, the drip was not a drip. It was a word. A single, clear syllable that formed in the air beside my ear, colder than the air around it. Soon, it was not a threat. It was an invitation, a statement of fact. The teacher is patient, but its curriculum is relentless. The first lesson was about the nature of the cage. The next lesson, I suspect, is about the exit. This morning, the mail brought a plain manila envelope. There was no return address, only my name typed in a simple, unadorned font. Inside was a single key. It was old, heavy, and made of tarnished brass. It was not the key to my apartment, or my car, or any lock I owned. It was the key to the handcuffs. I held it in my palm, its weight both familiar and alien. I had seen it only once, the night before Gavin clicked the first cuff shut. He had dangled it in front of me, smiling his charming, predatory smile, before pocketing it and going downstairs to hide it. He never told me where. The police never found it. Its arrival is not a mystery. It is a test, a final exam. The key is now on the kitchen counter, next to the fruit bowl with its decaying offerings. I look at it and I see not a key, but a question. The teacher is asking me if I have learned my lesson. It is asking me if I am ready to trade this small, noisy cage for the vast, silent one. Gavin used stones. He chose a permanent physical anchor. The key in my hand feels like the opposite. It is not a way to hold me down, but a tool to unlock the final door. The drip has fallen silent since the key arrived. The silence is different now. It is not an absence, but a presence. It is the quiet of a held breath, the pause before a verdict is read. I will not pack a bag. I will not write a note. These are the concerns of prisoners who still believe their actions matter in a world that cares nothing for them. I will simply finish my tea, wash the cup, and leave it to dry on the rack. A mundane, orderly gesture to cap off a mundane, orderly life. Then, I will pick up the key. I do not know where I am going, but the path has been laid out for me. It leads away from the noise, away from the light, and down into the quiet, waiting dark. The teacher is calling, and the class is about to begin. The key felt like a shard of ice in my hand, so cold it almost burned. I did not put it in my pocket. To do so would be to accept its purpose, to make a plan, and plans were for people who believed in a future. I simply held it, my fingers curled tight around its serrated teeth, and walked to my apartment door. I did not look back. There was nothing in that place I needed, nothing that belonged to the EMEM that was leaving. The hallway outside was empty, the patterned carpet stretching towards the elevator and the stairwell. I chose the stairs. The elevator was a smaller box, and I was done with boxes. The stairwell was concrete, echoing and cold. My footsteps were the only sound, a flat, final clap that was swallowed by the space. I had descended through the layers of the building, past the lives humming behind other doors. I could feel them in there, watching their televisions, arguing with their spouses, living their stories. The noise of it was a thin, desperate film over the great silence. I pushed open the heavy door to the lobby. The night air hit my face, a shock after the building's stale warmth. The city was a constellation of false stars, a brilliant lie told to keep the dark at bay. I started walking with no destination, my hand clenched around the key. It was my compass, its coldness a pull. I found myself at the edge of the river that cut through the city. The water was black, speckled with the reflected lights of the bridges, a liquid sky. The drip started again, but this time, it was not in my ears. It was in the water. Each ripple from the current was a drop falling into an infinite pool, a slow, rhythmic punctuation to the night. This was the place. I knew it. The teacher had led me here, not with a map, but by tuning my internal compass to its frequency. The key in my hand was no longer cold. It was warm, almost body temperature, as if it had become a part of me. The man was sitting on a bench, shrouded in shadow. I had not seen him approach. He was just there, a part of the scenery. He did not look at me, but stared out at the water, his posture one of infinite patience and fatigue. I knew without knowing how that he was like me, a graduate. He had heard the drip in his own life, in the hum of a refrigerator, in the tick of a clock, and he had followed it here. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence was an acknowledgement. We were 2 points of a constellation, waiting for the rest of the picture to be drawn. I looked down at the key in my hand. The final lesson was not about unlocking the physical door. It was about understanding that the lock was inside me, all along. The handcuffs, the cabin, the city, my own skin. They were all manifestations of the same fundamental constraint. The key was not for any of them. It was for the core of it. The belief that I was separate, that I was a self, that I was Holly. I closed my eyes. The sounds of the city faded, not to silence, but to a single pure tone. The drip became that tone, a resonant note that vibrated in my bones. I saw the scaffolding of my own mind, the intricate prison of memory and identity I had spent a lifetime building. I saw the walls, and I saw the door. I did not use the key. I understood. The key was the door. I opened my hand. The key was gone. It had not fallen. It had simply ceased to be separate from my palm. A coolness spread from my hand, up my arm, and throughout my body. It was not the cold of the river, but the cold of deep space, a clean, empty cold. I opened my eyes. The man on the bench was gone. The city was still there, but it was different. The lights were still bright, but they no longer hid anything. I could see through them, to the swirling dust and gas, the birth and death of stars in the neon signs. I could see the river for what it was, a flow of molecules, a temporary arrangement on its way to the sea. I was not standing beside it anymore. I was in it. I was of it. The handcuff was gone because the wrist was gone. The cage was gone because the bird had finally realized it was the sky. There is no more drip. There is only the sound of everything and the sound of nothing, and they are the same. The teacher is silent because the lesson is over. I am not waiting anymore. I am just here, and there, and everywhere. The class never ends. It just expands. The awareness that was once Holly now perceives the city not as a collection of separate objects, but as a single breathing entity. The honking of a taxi is the city clearing its throat. The steam rising from a manhole cover is its warm breath on a cold night. There is no more separation, no more frantic search for a meaning that was never missing, only misplaced. I walk, but the one who walks is no longer an individual. The feet on the pavement are simply an expression of the city's movement, a current of flesh and bone, no different from the current of water in the river or electricity in the wires overhead. The people I pass are not strangers. They are my own thoughts given form. my own dreams and nightmares walking beside me. The harried woman with the grocery bag is my anxiety. The laughing couple is a memory of a joy I once believed was mine. They are all me, and I am all of them. And we are all the city dreaming itself into existence. A police car slows beside me, its window rolling down. An officer with a tired, kind face looks out. "Miss, it's late. Everything all right? Do you need a ride somewhere?" His words are not words. They are a pattern of sound waves, a vibration in the air that my temporary human form interprets as concern. He sees a woman in a thin coat, walking aimlessly in the middle of the night. He sees a potential victim, a story that needs a better ending. He is building his sandcastle, and he is worried about mine. I look at him, and for a moment, I let him see, not the horror, not the void, but the truth behind my eyes, the vast, peaceful, indifferent unity of it all. His professional smile falters. The certainty in his eyes wavers, replaced by a flicker of profound, inexplicable confusion. He sees something in my gaze that his mind cannot categorize. It is not madness, not shock. It is something older. I am exactly where I need to be, I say. My voice is calm, a neutral fact. He stares for a second longer, then nods slowly, as if confirming something to himself. He rolls up the window and the car pulls away, its tires whispering on the damp asphalt. He will forget this, or he will remember it as a strange moment on a long shift. He will not be able to articulate the cold, clean truth that brushed against his soul. I continue my walk. The last vestiges of a personal past are dissolving like sugar in water. The memory of the cabin is a story I read once. The memory of Gavin is a character from that story. They have no more weight, no more emotional charge. They were just scenes in a play that helped me understand the nature of the stage. I find myself at a small playground, empty and silvered by the moon. I sit on a swing, the chains groaning softly. The physical sensation is there, the cool plastic seat, the gentle sway, but it is happening to a body, not to a cell. I push off with my feet, and the world begins to move around me. The apartment buildings sway like trees. The moon arcs across the sky. This is not an escape. It is an embrace. The final quiet understanding that there is nowhere to go because I am already everywhere. The teacher did not show me a way out of the prison. It showed me that the prison walls were made of my own reflection. Now that I have stopped looking for a self in the glass, the walls are gone. The swing slows. The dawn is beginning to bleed into the eastern sky, a pale, silent wound. This is the new day, and it is the same as the old day, and it is perfect. I stand up from the swing. The body is tired. It will return to the small apartment, to the rituals of eating and sleeping, not because it needs to, but because that is the pattern this particular collection of atoms is following. The locks on the door are as meaningless as the veins on a leaf. I am the drip. I am the silence between the drips. I am the key and the lock and the door. The class is in session, and everyone is the teacher, and everyone is the student forever. The body walks up the stairs, its feet making familiar sounds on the familiar carpet. The key is unnecessary for the apartment door, which opens as it always has. Inside, everything is as it was left. The cup is dry on the rack. The fruit in the bowl continues its slow, inevitable surrender. The body sits in a chair by the window, watching the city wake up. Cars begin to flow like blood cells through arteries. Lights in other windows flick on. The sleepwalkers are beginning their routines, their minds already building the walls of their day, fortifying themselves against the truth with coffee and to-do lists. There's a pang, a faint, distant echo from the person who used to live here. It is a feeling of pity, not for them, but for the struggle. The immense, heroic effort it takes to believe the dream is real. It is the same effort I once exerted. The phone rings. It is a shrill artificial sound, a jangle in the peaceful hum of the morning. The body does not startle. It observes the noise as it observes the distant siren or the chirp of a sparrow. The machine picks up after the fourth ring. It is my therapist, her voice laced with a concern that feels like a relic from another age. "Holly, it's Dr. Evans. You missed our appointment yesterday. I'm just checking in on you. Please give me a call back when you get this. I wanted to make sure you're okay." Her voice is a small, worried thing, a pebble dropped into a still ocean. It's ripples, but the ocean remains the ocean. She's a good woman, tending to her sandcastles, and I hope she never sees the tide for what it is. Some truths are not meant for every heart. The body stands and walks to the phone. It picks up the receiver, its movements smooth and efficient. There is no thought, only action. The voice that speaks is calm, clear, and belongs to the body. "Hello, Dr. Evans. This is Holly. Thank you for your call. I am fine, truly. I won't be needing any more appointments. Thank you for everything you tried to do." There is a pause on the other end. I can feel her confusion, her professional analysis already whirring, diagnosing this calmness as dissociation or denial. "Holly, are you sure? This sounds sudden. Maybe we should just have one more session to talk this through." "There is nothing to talk through," the voice says, and it is a statement of pure fact. "The lesson is over. Goodbye, Dr. Evans." The body places the receiver back in its cradle. The connection is severed. That chapter is closed. The sun is higher now, a bright, hard light that exposes the dust motes dancing in the air. They are not dirt. They are galaxies, swirling in the light of a sunbeam. Everything is exactly what it is, and also infinitely more. The body will make tea. It will drink the tea. It will perform the functions of life, not as a prisoner performing a routine, but as a river flowing in its bed. There is no more Holly, only the isness that she once contained. The drip has stopped because it was never really there. It was just an echo of my own isolation. Now that the walls are down, the sound has been replaced by the seamless, silent music of everything that is. Story 2. The thought arrived not as a memory, but as a stain, seeping up from the dark floorboards of the mind. It was a simple, childish image. A red balloon bobbing against a ceiling the color of old teeth. The string was not a string, but a long, wet tendon, and it was tied not to a weight, but to a small, pale finger. Anna blinked, and the image was gone, leaving only a cold vacancy behind her eyes. She was 7 years old, sitting at the kitchen table, and the thought felt like something left behind by a stranger who had passed through her head. Her mother, Melanie, noticed the pause, and a small hand, clutching a blue crayon, had frozen above a coloring book. Her usual fierce concentration, the one that filled princesses with violent, unstable-in-the-lines swaths of color, had evaporated. Now she was just still. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator, a monotonous drone that had become the soundtrack to their lives. "Honey, you okay?" Melanie asked, her voice carefully light, a thin coat of paint over rotting wood. Anna's eyes, the same deep brown as her mother's, shifted from the empty space to Melanie. They were not a child's eyes in that moment. They were old, flat, and reflective as tarnished coins. "The man in the corner is hungry," she said. Her voice was her own, the same high, clear bell, but the cadence was wrong. The words spaced like stones dropped into a deep well. Melanie's blood went thin and cold. She followed her daughter's gaze to the empty corner of the bright, sunlit kitchen. There was nothing there but a spider plant and the gentle, dust-moted light of a Tuesday afternoon. "There's no one there, sweetie." Anna's head tilted, a gesture both alien and precise. "He's always there. He's peeling the paint. He's peeling everything. Man, That was the first day. The omens accumulated like dust in a sealed room. The pediatrician found nothing. The child psychologist spoke of anxiety, of an overactive imagination, a possible dissociative disorder. Melanie nodded, took the pamphlets, and knew, with a certainty that felt like a shard of ice in her heart, that it was all wrong. Science was a language for a world that no longer existed. Not in her house, not with her daughter. The house itself began to change. It was in the small things, the sensory details that pricked at the edges of reality. The smell of the place shifted. It was no longer the scent of lemon cleaner and laundry, but a damp, earthy odor, like a long-closed tomb, or a forest floor after a rain, thick with decay. The air grew heavy, humid, clinging to the skin like a film of oil. Melanie would wake in the deep hours to the sound of scratching, a dry, insistent whisper from within the walls, as if something were trying to dig its way out from the inside. Sometimes it was a wet, rhythmic sound, like a tongue licking stone. And Anata, sweet, fierce Anna was receding, like a shoreline being swallowed by a slow black tide. She would speak in languages she could not know, guttural syllables that clawed at the air. She would contort her small body into impossible positions, her spine arching like a drawn bow, her joints popping with a sound like stepping on dry twigs. Her voice would drop to a gravelly baritone, a voice that was all phlegm and malice, and it would whisper things. It would whisper the secret, shameful fears Melanie had never spoken aloud. It would describe the way her husband had looked in his coffin, the specific waxy pallor of his skin. It would recite the phone number of her first lover, a thing forgotten for 20 years. It was after an incident with the family cat, a placid old tabby that was found pressed flat and impossibly two-dimensional beneath Anna's bed, that Melanie called the church. She did not call her own, a modern place of light and folk songs, but St. Bartholomew's, a crumbling gray stone fortress downtown. The man who answered was a Father Donovan Young, his voice full of a brittle, earnest faith. He was sympathetic, but hesitant. This was not standard practice. It was a superior, Father Chase, who appeared at her door 2 days later. He was a man in his late 60s, with a face like a weathered map of a hard country. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they held no easy comfort, only a deep, weary knowledge. He did not bring a Bible, but a small, worn leather bag. He stood on the porch and did not step inside, his gaze sweeping over the facade of the house, lingering on the windows which seemed, even in the daylight, to be filmed with a faint opacity. "It knows its name," Chase said, his voice a low rumble. He wasn't looking at Melanie, but at the doorframe. "It has written it on the air here. Can you not feel it? The pressure." Melanie could only nod, her throat tight. She led him inside. The investigation was a quiet, terrible ritual. Chase moved through the rooms with a deliberate slowness, his presence a rock in the unsettled atmosphere of the house. Donovan followed, his younger face a mask of conflicted emotion. His faith a bright new coin he was afraid was turning out to be counterfeit. They set up cameras. They recorded the drop in temperature in Anna's room, a cold that was not the absence of heat, but an active, invasive chill. They captured the whispers on digital audio, the voice that was not Anna's snarling promises of rot and ruin. One night, Chase sat with Melanie at the kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator their only company. "It is not a demon in the way the films show," he said. His hands curled around a mug of tea he did not drink. "They get that wrong. It is not a person. It is a force, an intelligence from a place where the rules are different. It is old, Mrs. Evans, older than sin. It covets the warmth of a soul. It is a parasite of the spirit. It finds a crack, a grief, a fear, a moment of profound weakness, and it pushes its way in. Ah, my husband, Melanie whispered. He died. Last year, Anna was. She was broken. Chase nodded slowly. Crack. Just a crack. And this thing it slithers in. It doesn't hate you. Not in the way we understand it. It is simply hungry. And your daughter is its meal. Your daughter is its meal. The decision to perform the rite of exorcism was not made lightly. The bishop, a pragmatic man, was skeptical. But Chase had seen the evidence, heard the recordings, felt the palpable wrongness that had taken root in the home. He argued with the weight of a 40-year career spent in the dim, forgotten corners of the world where light was a theory, not a reality. Permission was granted, reluctantly, with the condition that Donovan assist and document everything. They prepared the room. Anna's bedroom was stripped of its childish things, the stuffed animals and colorful posters removed. The windows were covered with black cloth. The air grew thick with the smell of incense, which did not mask the underlying stench of decay, but fought a losing battle against it, creating a cloying, funereal perfume. Candles were lit, their flames casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. They brought Anna in. She was listless, her small body limp in Donovan's arms. They laid her on the bare mattress and fastened the leather restraints. It was a horrific necessity. As Chase began to speak the first Latin words, the room seemed to inhale. The change was instantaneous. Anna's eyes flew open, black and depthless. Her body strained against the straps, not with the strength of a child, but with a power that made the leather creak and the bed frame groan. The voice that erupted from her was the guttural roar from the recordings, a sound of tearing rock and collapsing mountains. "This one is ours," it snarled. "You are old mate. Your words are dust." "Nay." Chase did not flinch. His voice was a steady, rhythmic counterpoint. The ancient Latin, a wall he was building against the chaos. He held up the crucifix. The entity inside Anna recoiled, not in fear, but in a kind of rapturous, mocking disgust. It laughed, a sound like shattering glass. "That symbol. We were here before your god learned his name. We swim in the spaces between the stars he claims to have made. For hours," it went on, a brutal, spiritual tug of war. Chase's voice grew hoarse. Sweat poured down his face, and his certainty, his weary knowledge, began to show hairline fractures. Donovan, reciting the responses, felt his own faith crumbling. The things it said, the secrets it whispered about his own hidden doubts, his private shames, were arrows that found their mark. The room grew colder. The candle flames stretched into long, thin ribbons of blue light, then guttered, leaving them in near darkness. The scratching in the walls became a frantic, drumming beat. The climax came not with a shout, but with a terrible, intimate whisper. The entity, using Anna's mouth, stopped its raging. It went perfectly still. It looked at Melanie, who was huddled in the corner, her hands pressed to her mouth. "Mama," it said, in Anna's own sweet voice. A perfect imitation. "Mama, it's so dark in here. Please, let me go. I'm so scared." Melanie sobbed, a raw, broken sound. It was her daughter. It was her Anna. "Don't listen," Chase croaked, his voice a ruin. "It lies. It always lies." "He hurts me, Mama," the voice wept. "The old man, he puts the cold words on me. Make him stop." Melanie looked from the pathetic, trembling form of her child to the exhausted, grim face of the priest. The battle was not between good and evil in that moment. It was between hope and despair. The entity was offering her the one thing she wanted, the return of her daughter, and it was using that love as its final, most potent weapon. "It's a trick, Melanie," Chase said, his eyes pleading. You must hold fast." The thing in Anna smiled, a tiny heartbreaking curl of the lips that was entirely honest. "Remember the red balloon, Mama? You bought it for me. At the fair?" "Ah." And Melanie did remember. A memory she had forgotten. A red balloon bought for a 3-year-old Anna, who had let it go, watching it soar into the sky until it was a speck, then nothing. They had laughed about it. The entity had not given her a foreign thought. It had stolen one of her own, one of her most precious, and tainted it. Something in Melanie snapped, not into brokenness, but into a fierce, clear rage. This thing was not just taking her daughter's body. It was defiling her memories, the very fabric of their love. She stood up. Her voice, when it came, was low and steady, stripped of all fear. "No," she said. "You do not get that. You get nothing." She walked to the bed, past the stunned priests, and she looked directly into the black eyes of the thing that wore her daughter's face. "Anna," she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that did not belong to a grieving mother, but to something primordial. "Anna, come back to me, now." For a single suspended second, nothing happened. Then, a flicker, a tremor in the small body. The blackness in the eyes swirled, and for a heartbeat, Melanie saw her daughter's deep brown gaze, terrified and confused. The entity shrieked, a sound of pure, thwarted fury. It was the sound of a door slamming shut. Chase, seeing the crack, roared the final prayers, his voice finding its power again. Donovan, inspired by Melanie's impossible faith, joined him. The air crackled. The oppressive weight in the room lifted all at once, like a vacuum breaking. Anna's body convulsed once, violently, and then fell still. A foul, cold wind rushed through the room, though the windows were sealed, carrying with it the last, fading whisper of a defeated hunger. Then, silence. True silence. The humming of the refrigerator was gone. The scratching in the walls had ceased. The only sound was Anna's soft, regular breathing. She was asleep, a normal, exhausted sleep. In the days that followed, a fragile peace settled over the house. The smells faded. The air grew light. Anna was herself again, if quieter, more thoughtful. She had no memory of the ordeal, only a vague recollection of bad dreams. Father Donovan left, his faith shaken but reforged into something more complex and resilient. Father Chase stayed for a time, a quiet, watchful presence, before returning to his gray stone church, the weight on his shoulders a little heavier. Melanie cleaned the house. She washed the black cloth from the windows and let the sunlight flood in. She put Anna's stuffed animals back on her bed. She was sweeping the kitchen floor one afternoon, the mundane motion a soothing balm when she found it. Under the edge of the kitchen table, tucked against the baseboard, was a small, shriveled piece of red rubber. It was the remains of a balloon. Not a new one, but one that had been withered and desiccated for a long, long time. The string was not a string, but a thin, dark, fibrous thread, like a dried tendon. She did not scream. She did not call Chase. She simply stopped sweeping and looked at it. She thought of the first thought, the stain that had seeped into Anna's mind. The red balloon against the ceiling. The man in the corner, hungry. She understood then. The ritual had not killed the entity. It had not banished it to some other hell. It had merely closed the door. But doors can be opened again. The thing was still out there, in the spaces between, patient, ancient, and hungry. It had left a part of itself behind, a seed, a memory, a single, silent, unexplainable detail. Melanie remained still, the broom handle cool in her hand, observing the shriveled red scrap on her clean floor. She did not pick it up. She did not throw it away. She simply accepted its presence. a dark period at the end of a terrible sentence, a promise that the story was not, and might never be, truly over. She finished sweeping around it, leaving the small, desiccated thing untouched on the floor. A strange, cold pragmatism settled over her. To remove it felt like an admission, a reaction that might be noticed. So she let it lie. A tiny, malignant period at the end of her sentence. Life, however, demanded to be lived. Anna needed breakfast, needed to be walked to the bus stop, needed her mother to smile and wave as the yellow vehicle carried her away. Melanie performed these rituals with a new, sharp focus. Every smile was a shield. Every wave was a warding gesture. She kept the house obsessively clean, not to erase the past, but to monitor the present. She needed to know if anything else appeared, if the environment changed again. She was a sentinel now. A week after finding the balloon, she was putting away Anna's laundry. She folded a small flower-printed shirt and opened the top drawer of the dresser. There, nestled among the socks, was a single, long gray feather. It was not from any bird she knew. It was too long, too perfectly ash-gray, and it felt cold to the touch, like stone. Her breath hitched. This was new. This was a postscript. She left the feather where it was. She did not mention it to Anna, who seemed to be thriving, her color returning, her laughter once again filling the rooms, unaware of the secret sharer in her sock drawer. That evening, Melanie drove to St. Bartholomew's. Father Chase was in his study, surrounded by books that smelled of dust and old leather. He listened to her description of the balloon and the feather without interruption. His weathered hand steepled under his chin. When she finished, he sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. "Here's a signature," he said. "A calling card. They are prideful, these things. They do not like to be bested. It is reminding you that it remembers, that it has marked this place, and the child in it. And, is it coming back?" Melanie asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It never truly left," Chase replied. "We forced it out of the vessel, out of the house. We slammed the door, but its attention is still here, like a pressure. These objects, they are a way of pushing back, testing the locks." He looked at her, his wintry eyes full of a grim respect. "You did not panic. That was wise. Fear is a key it can use. What do I do? You continue as you are. You guard your daughter. You guard your own mind. These manifestations are attempts to provoke a reaction, to create a new crack. Your stability, your love for the girl, that is the wall it cannot breach. It is the only wall that matters." He gave her a small, plain wooden cross, old and smooth from handling. "Not for prayer," he said. "For focus, a tangible thing to hold on to when the fear comes. It is a reminder of your own will." Melanie took it. It felt warm in her hand, unlike the feather. That night, after tucking Anna in, she stood in the hallway, listening to her daughter's soft, even breathing. The house was quiet, but it was a different quiet than before. It was the quiet of a battlefield, after the fighting has moved on. A silence pregnant with the memory of violence and the threat of its return. She was not the woman she had been a month ago, the grieving widow trying to hold the pieces together. That woman was gone, swept away in the cold wind that had rushed from her daughter's room. She was a keeper now, a guardian of a fragile peace. She looked down the dark hallway towards the kitchen, knowing the red scraps still lay under the table. She looked towards Anna's room, knowing the cold feather rested among her socks. They were not just remnants of a horror. They were challenges. And as she stood her watch in the silent house, a part of her, a part that had been forged in that room during the exorcism, accepted the challenge. She was not waiting for it to be over anymore. She was waiting for it to begin again. And she would be ready. She began to study. While Anna was at school, Melanie did not clean or run errands. She went to the library, avoiding the esoteric sections that might draw attention, and instead focused on history, architecture, and geology. She read about the land the house was built on, about the town's oldest structures, about local legends that had been sanitized into folklore. She was looking for a pattern, a source. Father Chase had called it a force from a place with different rules. She needed it to understand the rules. She found a mention of a local settler's tale, a story about a gray watcher in the woods, a presence that was said to leave cold stones and withered tokens near the homes of those it favored. The story was a footnote, a curiosity, but the description of the tokens made her hands go cold. She began to map the town's older neighborhoods, the ones built before the war, and cross-referenced them with odd, unsolved incidents from police blotters and old newspaper archives. A cluster of seemingly unrelated events, a series of household pets gone missing in the 1950s, a string of sleepwalking cases in the 1970s, a peculiar, localized depression that affected 3 families on the same street in the 1990s, all centered on a half-mile radius from her home. She was no longer just a sentinel. She was an archivist of the uncanny, building a case against an invisible defendant. She kept her findings in a plain notebook, written in neat, deliberate hand. She did not share this with Father Chase. His was a spiritual war, fought with prayer and ritual. Hers was becoming something else, a battle of understanding. If this thing was a parasite, it had a life cycle. It had habits. It had a history here. One Tuesday, Anna came home from school quiet. She pushed her peas around her plate at dinner. "Mom," she said, her voice small, "there was a man today. At the park. After school." "No!" Melanie's blood went still. "What man, sweetie?" "He was by the big oak tree. He was tall and gray." Anna looked up, her eyes clear and confused. "He smiled at me, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was like he knew a secret." "Did he say anything? Did he come near you?" Melanie fought to keep the panic from her voice. Anna shook her head. "No, he just stood there." Then the bell rang to go back inside, and when I looked again, he was gone. She frowned. "It was probably just a dream, right? I get mixed up sometimes." Melanie felt the wooden cross in her pocket, its edges digging into her palm. This was not a token left in the dark. This was an escalation. It was showing itself to Anna, testing the waters of her memory, seeing if the crack could be reopened. The entity was no longer just whispering from the shadows of the house. It was walking abroad in the daylight, wearing a form that only her daughter could see. The battle lines had just expanded, and the war for Anna's soul was now being fought on 2 fronts. She forced a calm she did not feel into her voice. "It probably was a dream, honey, a very vivid one." She reached across the table and took Anna's hand. "But if you ever see him again, anywhere, you come and tell me right away. Okay? Even if you think it's just a dream." Anna nodded, seemingly satisfied, and went back to pushing her peas. Melanie's mind, however, was racing. The park was 3 blocks from the school, a public, sunlit place. This was a brazen move. The thing was not just testing the locks anymore. It was rattling the doorknob, confident it would not be seen by anyone but its intended target. That night, after Anna was asleep, Melanie did not open her notebook. Instead, she took the wooden cross and a heavy flashlight from the kitchen drawer. She walked the perimeter of her property, the beam of light cutting stark lines through the darkness. She was not looking for anything in particular. She was establishing a presence. She was marking her territory, just as the entity was marking hers. She paused at the base of the old oak tree in her backyard, its branches skeletal against the moonlit sky. The air here felt still and watchful. The next morning, she drove Anna to school herself, scanning the streets, the parked cars, the spaces between buildings. She saw nothing out of the ordinary. After dropping Anna off, she did not go to the library. She went to the park. She stood under the big oak tree Anna had described. The ground was bare, the grass worn away by countless children's feet. She saw no footprints, no cold spots, no signs at all, but the feeling was there. A faint, oily residue on the air, a psychic stain that made the back of her neck prickle. She knew then that Father Chase's approach, for all its power, was insufficient. It was reactive. It waited for the thing to strike and then fought it back. She could not live that way, always on the defensive, waiting for the next gray feather, the next apparition. She needed to find its anchor, the point from which it was operating. If it was old, as Chase said, then it was tied to this place, to this land, in a way she did not yet understand. On her way home, she stopped at a hardware store. She bought a new deadbolt for the front door, a motion sensor light for the backyard, and a simple, off-the-shelf home security camera. It was a start. It was a modern ward against an ancient evil. As she installed the deadbolt, her hands steady with the screwdriver, she realized the transformation within herself was complete. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was fuel. She was no longer just a keeper or a guardian. She was a hunter, and her quarry had just shown her that it was not as patient as she had been led to believe. It had grown bold, and in its boldness, it had made a mistake. It had revealed that it was not just in the house or in the spaces between, but here, in her town, and that meant it could be found. She set up the camera to point at the backyard, specifically at the old oak tree. The feed went to an app on her phone. It was a flimsy shield, she knew, but it was a start. That afternoon, she called the school and quietly, without giving a reason, added herself to the list of approved adults who could pick up Anna Need. She would not let her daughter walk home alone anymore. The days took on a new rhythm, a dual existence. On the surface, they were mother and daughter, doing homework and making pizza and watching cartoons. Underneath, Melanie was a strategist, her every action a calculated move in a silent war. She watched the camera feed obsessively, seeing only squirrels and shifting shadows. She checked Anna's backpack and room each day, finding nothing but school books and crayons. The stillness felt like a taunt. It was a Thursday when the pattern broke. Anna was drawing at the kitchen table, her tongue stuck out in concentration. Melanie was washing dishes, her back to the room, when she felt the air in the room thicken. It was the same pressure from before the exorcism, a dense, listening silence. "Mom," Anna said, her voice curiously flat. "The man says you're looking for him." Melanie turned slowly, the dishcloth dripping in her hand. Anna was not looking at her. She was looking at her drawing. It was a crude crayon sketch of their house. In the upper window of Anna's room, a stick figure with a gray face looked out. And in the backyard, under the oak tree, stood another gray figure, this one much taller. A thin, black line, like a string or a tendon, connected the two figures from the window down to the one in the yard. "As you won't like what you find," Anna continued, still in that unnervingly monotone voice. Then she blinked, shook her head, and looked at her drawing with a confused frown. "That's weird. I don't remember drawing that." Melanie's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She walked over and looked at the picture. The entity was not just showing itself. It was showing her its structure. The thing in the yard was the source, the anchor. The presence in the house, the one that had possessed Anna, was just an extension, a limb. They had only fought the limb. She folded the drawing and put it in her pocket. "It's just a drawing, honey," she said, her voice miraculously steady. "Why don't you go watch TV for a bit?" As Anna left the room, Melanie pulled out her phone and opened the camera app. The live feed of the backyard was empty. The oak tree stood alone. She switched to the recorded history, scrolling back to the time Anna had been drawing. For a few minutes, there was nothing. Then, a distortion, a flicker of static, and for 3 perfect seconds, the figure was there. Tall and gray, standing exactly where Anna had drawn it. Its featureless face turned not towards the house, but directly towards the camera lens. Then it was gone, and the feed returned to normal. It knew about the camera. It was posing for her. Melanie did not feel fear this time. She felt a cold, clarifying certainty. The hunt was over. The quarry had revealed its location. She looked from the phone in her hand to the folded drawing in her pocket. The thing had made its second mistake. It had underestimated a mother's resolve, mistaking her silence for submission. It had shown her the target. Now, she just had to find the weapon. She waited until Anna was engrossed in a cartoon. The cheerful sounds a stark contrast to the silence in the kitchen. She took the drawing and her phone to the basement, the one place in the house that still felt separate, untouched by the recent horrors. She spread the crayon picture on her workbench, the 2 gray figures, and the connecting line a child's map to a nightmare. The anchor was in the yard, under the oak tree. The rational part of her mind, a part that had been to college and paid a mortgage, told her to call Father Chase, to let the professional handle this with holy water and ancient rites. But that part was small now, a distant voice. The ritual had been a defense. It had been about expulsion. This was different. This was about eradication. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that Chase's tools were not meant for this. They were meant to shut the door, not to burn down the house on the other side. She needed a different kind of professional. It took her 2 days to find a name, buried in the digital archives of a defunct university parapsychology department. Dr. Alistair Finch. His research was fringe, dismissed by his peers, focused on the material resonance of non-corporeal entities. He believed that things like the gray man left a physical trace, a kind of residue that could be interacted with, and more importantly, disrupted. His last known address was a P.O. box in a city 3 hours away. She wrote him a letter. She did not mention possession or exorcisms. She wrote about persistent anomalous phenomena, recurring material manifestations, and a suspected terrestrial anchor point. She used the clinical language she had taught herself from his papers. She included a photograph of the drawing and a printout of the camera feed showing the gray figure. She mailed it and waited, the days stretching taut with a new kind of tension. Anna, thankfully, had no more episodes. The man in the park and the strange drawing seemed to have been purged from her memory as thoroughly as the possession itself. Melanie watched her daughter play, a fierce protective love burning inside her. She was doing this for her. She was going to dig up the root of this evil, no matter what it cost. A week later, a reply came, not to her house, but to a temporary P.O. box she had rented. The letter was typed on an old, faded typewriter. "Your case is compelling," it read. "The manifestation is audacious, which suggests a deep-seated and powerful anchor. Your hypothesis is correct. A spiritual defense is a shield. To destroy the anchor requires a physical intervention. I can provide a methodology, but you must understand the risk. Severing an anchor does not destroy the entity. It severs its connection to your location." Enclosed were 2 pages of single-spaced instructions. They did not call for holy water or crucifixes, but for iron shavings, specific types of quartz crystal, a precise mixture of salt and silver nitrate, and a great deal of wiring connected to a series of high-capacity batteries. It was a recipe, a scientific exorcism, a bomb designed for a ghost. The final line of the letter was typed in all caps. "The anchor will be defended. It will know what you are attempting. You must be prepared." Melanie read the instructions until she had them memorized. She gathered the components from chemical supply stores and electronic shops, her purchases mundane and unremarkable. She stored everything in a locked toolbox in the basement. She watched the oak tree through the camera, seeing nothing but wind and leaves. She was ready. She would wait for a night when Anna was staying at a friend's house, a sleepover she had already carefully arranged. She would dig. She would build Dr. Finch's machine, and she would pull the trigger. She was no longer waiting for the war to begin again. She was about to start the final battle. The night of the sleepover arrived with a clear, cold sky. Melanie kissed Anna goodbye, her smile a careful lie, and watched her daughter skip to her friend's car, a backpack full of pajamas and stuffed animals slung over her shoulder. The moment the car turned the corner, the smile vanished from Melanie's face. The house was empty. It was time. She carried the locked toolbox from the basement and set it on the kitchen table. The contents were an absurd juxtaposition: a small, powerful shovel next to delicate quartz points, heavy-gauge electrical wire coiled beside a bag of purified salt. She followed Dr. Finch's instructions with the precision of a bomb squad technician, measuring and mixing the compounds into a fine, gray powder. She packed this into a series of porous ceramic containers, each wired to a central control unit salvaged from a remote-controlled car. As the moon rose, casting long, distorted shadows from the oak tree, she went into the yard. The air was bitingly cold, far colder than the weather forecast had predicted. She ignored it, driving the shovel into the earth at the base of the tree. The physical labor was a relief, a simple, brutal task in a war that was anything but. With each shovelful of dark soil, she felt a growing resistance, not from the earth, but from the atmosphere. The silence became a low, sub-audible hum that vibrated in her teeth. She hit the anchor point about 3 feet down. It was not a bone or a box. It was a knot of roots, ancient and gnarled. But these roots were wrong. They were bleached a sickly gray-white and were cold as ice to the touch. They had grown in a perfect interwoven sphere, and nestled within them were objects: a tarnished silver locket, a child's marble, a single yellowed bone that looked too small to be human, and a single gray feather. This was its nest, its collection of trophies. Working quickly, her breath pluming in the frigid air, she packed the ceramic containers deep into the root knot, weaving the wires through the bleached wood. She sprinkled the iron shavings in a wide circle around the hole and placed the quartz points at the cardinal directions. Her hands were numb, but they did not shake. She was connecting the final wire to the battery when the humming stopped. The backyard fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. She looked up. The gray man was there, standing at the edge of the circle of iron shavings. It was more solid than she had ever seen it, no longer a flicker on a screen or a sketch in a drawing. Its tall, slender form seemed to drink the moonlight, and its featureless face was turned towards the hole she had dug. It did not look at her. It looked at its own exposed heart. Melanie's fingers fumbled with the wire, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the defense Finch had warned her about. It was here to stop her. It took a step forward, its foot passing through the iron shavings as if they were not there. The air temperature plummeted. Frost crackled across the grass, racing towards her. She saw its long gray arm begin to rise, not towards her, but towards the house, towards Anna's window. A raw, primal fury surged through Melanie, burning away the last traces of her fear. It thought it could still use her daughter against her. "No," she said, her voice a low snarl in the perfect quiet. The thing's head turned slowly. The blank expanse of its face regarded her. Melanie held up the remote trigger, her thumb poised over the single red button. "This is between you and me." For a timeless second, they faced each other across the frozen yard. The mother and the ancient thing. Then, with a final defiant look into that blank gray face, Melanie pressed the button. There was no explosion of light and sound. There was only a deep, resonant thump that she felt in her bones, a sound that seemed to be pulled from the earth itself. The ceramic containers emitted a single blinding pulse of white light. The root knot blackened and crumbled into ash. The collected trophies, the locket, the marble, the bone, the feather, shattered into fine, inert dust. The gray man did not scream. It unraveled, its form frayed at the edges, dissolving into a cloud of agitated, static mist. For a moment, the mist hung in the air, formless and furious. Then, with a sound like a vast intake of breath, it collapsed inward and was gone. The crushing silence broke. The normal sounds of the night returned, the distant hum of a car, the rustle of a breeze in the branches. The unnatural frost on the grass began to melt. Melanie stood alone in the hole, shivering. The remote still clutched in her numb hand. The anchor was gone. The connection was severed. She climbed out of the hole, her body aching with a profound exhaustion. She looked at the empty space where the entity had stood. Dr. Finch's warning echoed in her mind. It was a gamble. The entity was not destroyed. It was cast out, set adrift. She had won this battle, secured her home, protected her daughter. But as she stared into the dark, quiet woods beyond her fence, she knew with a cold certainty that the war was not over. She had not killed the gray man. She had made it homeless. And a homeless predator would eventually need to find a new place to hunt. Story 3. The chair sat in the corner of the room, an island of worn velvet in a sea of scuffed floorboards. It was not an extraordinary chair, not by any measure an antique of value, but it possessed a certain gravity, a stillness that seemed to absorb the light and sound around it. Its maroon fabric was bald in patches, the dark wood of its frame scarred with the ghosts of 100 careless encounters. It was always slightly turned away from the center of the room, as if its occupant had just risen and stepped into the shadows, or as if it were politely refusing to face the proceedings. No one ever sat in it. This was an unspoken rule, as fundamental as breathing. In the small town of Stillwater, where the silence had a texture and the nights were a shade darker than anywhere else, the old men gathered. They met in the back room of Callahan's Tavern, a place that smelled of pine sol and regret, the air thick with the ghosts of their own cigarettes. There were 5 of them, a council of wrinkled hands and rheumy eyes, bound not by friendship, but by a shared secret that had festered in their hearts for 50 years. There was Frank, the former sheriff, his voice a low gravel road. There was Al, who had once run the hardware store, and now seemed made of the same dried-out wood he used to sell. There was George, whose hands trembled constantly, and the twins, Walter and William, so identical in their fear they might as well have been one man split in 2. Their ritual was simple. They would drink cheap whiskey and tell stories. Not tall tales of Paul Bunyan, but the other stories, the ones whispered in Stillwater after the sun went down. Stories of the thing in the reeds by the river, the face in the upstairs window of the Miller place, the sound of dragging footsteps from the empty culvert under Main Street. They told them not for pleasure, but as a ward, a kind of verbal suturing to keep the real horror at bay. They were practicing an ancient magic of distraction, hoping the small fears would satiate the larger one. Tonight, the air was different. A cold draft snaked under the door, though it was a warm September evening. The single bulb overhead flickered, casting their aged faces into a stuttering dance of light and deep shadow. "Tell the one about the photograph," George whispered, his knuckles white around his glass. Frank shook his head. A slow, ponderous movement. "No, not that one." "Then the one about the radio that played only the sound of breathing," Walter offered, his voice thin as paper. "They're just stories," Al said. But the words were hollow, a chant he no longer believed in. His eyes, like all of theirs, kept drifting to the empty velvet chair. Their real story, the one they never told, began half a century ago with a boy named Elias Trant. He was a strange, quiet boy who lived with his mother in a tar paper shack down by the railroad tracks. He collected things: broken bottles, bird skulls, smooth river stones, and he had a way of looking at you that felt less like seeing and more like an excavation. The children called him a witch boy. The adults just crossed the street to avoid him. The 5 men, then boys themselves, full of a cruel, unthinking vigor, had decided Elias was the source of a blight that had fallen on the town. A summer sickness that had taken a toddler. There was no evidence, only the feverish logic of a mob. They cornered him one evening in the old limestone quarry, a place of deep, still water and echoing walls. They didn't mean to kill him. They told themselves that for 50 years. It was just a game, a scare. They had tied an old millstone, heavy and pocked with fossils, around his ankles with a length of thick rope. A joke, they said. See if the witch boy can sink. But Elias had not struggled. He had looked at each of them in turn, his dark eyes holding no fear, only a vast and ancient knowing, and he had spoken 7 words, his voice clear and carrying over the dark water. I will come back for my chair. Then he stepped off the edge. The water swallowed him without a splash. The men, boys no longer, fled. They told everyone Elias had run away. They buried the truth so deep it became a part of their marrow, a cold stone in their guts. And a week later, the chair appeared in the back room of Callahan's. No one knew how it got there. It was just there, facing the wall. And they all knew, without a word being spoken, that it was his chair. Now, 50 years to the day, the stories were no longer working. A young man named Leo, Frank's grandson, had started coming to the tavern. He was a writer, or wanted to be, and he was fascinated by the old men and their eerie tales. He saw them as quaint, local color. He sat at the bar, notebook open, listening to the fragments of their conversations, the names of places and people long gone. He was particularly taken with the legend of Elias Trant, the boy who vanished. What did he look like? Leo asked Frank one night. Frank's face closed like a door. Thin, dark hair. It doesn't matter. And he just disappeared? No one looked for him? Some people are meant to disappear, Frank had said, his voice final. But Leo kept looking. He went to the library, to the town records. He found a single blurry photograph in a yearbook. Elias Trant had a pale, sharp face and eyes that were too large for it. He looked both young and immeasurably old. Leo felt a strange pull, a sense of recognition that was deeply unsettling, as if he were remembering a dream he'd never had. He started having dreams of his own, dreams of deep, cold water, and of a voice that was not a voice but a pressure in his ears, saying, "It's time." He began to see things out of the corner of his eye, a flicker of movement in a dark window that resolved into his own reflection, a wet footprint on the dried porch floorboards that vanished when he looked directly at it. The town itself seemed to be holding its breath. The river, usually a lazy brown snake, ran high and fast, its water tasting of limestone and secrets. The shadows in the quarry grew longer, denser, as if they were solidifying. Back in the tavern, the old men were crumbling. George was the first to break. He was found drowned in his own bathtub, a look of serene terror on his face. The police called it an accident, a fall. But Frank went to see the body. In George's rigid hand, clutched so tight they had to break his fingers to remove it, was a smooth, gray river stone. The story stopped. The whiskey remained untouched. The 5 were now 4, and the silence in the back room was a physical presence, broken only by the frantic ticking of the clock and the creak of the floorboards when one of them shifted their weight. They didn't need to speak. Their shared guilt was a language of its own. Walter went next. He simply vanished from his bed. The only thing out of place was his window, open to the cool night, and on the sill, a single wet leaf shaped like a hat. The line between their stories and reality didn't just blur, it dissolved. William, his twin, began to speak in a voice that was not his own, a dry, rustling whisper. He talked of cold currents and the weight of stone, of the patience of deep water. He would sit for hours, staring at the velvet chair until his wife led him away, sobbing. The townspeople, who had always sensed the rot at the heart of Stillwater, locked their doors a little earlier. They felt the curse like a change in barometric pressure, a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. Leo, caught in the riptide of this unfolding horror, felt the past reaching for him. He found Frank one rain-swept night, sitting on the porch swing, staring into the downpour. The old man looked gutted, his authority and pride stripped away, leaving only a terrified old soul. "It was us, Leo," Frank said, his voice raw. "We killed him, in the quarry. We tied a stone to his feet and he just stepped off." He told the story then, the whole ugly truth, and with every word, Leo felt the world to become thinner, more fragile. The quaint local legend was now a blood-soaked reality, and it was hunting his family. "They said he'd come back for his chair," Frank whispered, his eyes wide with a child's fear. "And he is. He's not coming for revenge. He's just coming home, and he needs a place to sit." The climax arrived on the anniversary night, a storm raging over Stillwater, whipping the trees into a frenzy and turning the streets into shallow rivers. The remaining three old men, Frank, Al, and the broken William, were in the back room of Callahan's. They were not hiding. There was no point. The hunt was over. Leo was with them, unable to abandon his grandfather, drawn into the final act of a play written before he was born. The tavern was empty. The power was out. They huddled around a single kerosene lamp, its flame throwing their monstrous, dancing shadows on the walls. The wind howled like a chorus of the dead. And then, another sound wove itself into the storm's symphony. A slow, dragging sound, heavy and wet, coming from the main room of the tavern. Step, dot, pine, drag, dot. Step, dotting, drag, gag. It was the sound of something walking with a great weight tied to its feet. William began to weep silently. Al closed his eyes and prayed. Frank stood up, his back straight, the sheriff for one last moment. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs, a trapped bird. The door to the back room swung inward. There was no monstrous form, no rotting corpse. There was only a presence, a concentration of cold and damp that rushed into the room, making the lamp flame gutter. The smell of the quarry filled the air, wet stone, deep water, and ancient rot. Leo saw nothing, but he felt it. A consciousness vast and cold and utterly alien, focused entirely on the velvet chair. The chair trembled. The dust of 50 years rose from its fabric in a shimmering cloud. And then, the velvet upholstery compressed, as if an invisible weight had settled into it. A deep indentation formed in the seat in the back, the shape of a slender, seated figure. A patch of the fabric darkened, spreading outwards from the center of the backrest, a stain of profound dampness. Frank let out a soft, choked sigh. He took a single step forward, his hand outstretched not in defense, but in a gesture of futile apology. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the floor. A trickle of water, clear and cold, leaked from his parted lips. Al screamed, a short, sharp sound that was cut off as if by a switch. He clawed at his throat, his face turning a mottled purple. He collapsed beside Frank, his body convulsing once before lying still. William simply folded in on himself. His weeping stopped, his head lolling to the side. He was gone. Leo was alone. The cold presence in the room was now a crushing force. He could not move, could not breathe. He stared at the chair, at the invisible occupant, and he understood. This was not a ghost. It was something older, something that had worn the skin of a boy named Elias Trant for a little while, and was now simply reclaiming a piece of property it had left behind. The horror was not personal. It was cosmic. They had not murdered a human boy. They had disturbed something that was merely resting at the bottom of a quarry, and it had decided to use them as a doorway back. The pressure in the room shifted. The presence was leaving. The damp patch on the chair began to recede. The indentation slowly lifted. The crushing cold abated. The dragging sound started again, moving away from him, through the tavern and out into the storm. Leo did not know how long he sat there on the floor, surrounded by the 3 dead men. When the dawn finally came, gray and weak, it found him still there, his mind a blank slate of terror. The police came, and the ambulances. They asked him questions, but he had no answers they would understand. He inherited his grandfather's house. He stayed in Stillwater. The town tried to forget, to bury its secrets under a new layer of normalcy. But the silence was deeper now, the shadows more persistent. And in his study, in the corner, sits a chair. It is not the velvet chair from the tavern, which was burned to ashes the day after the deaths. This is a simple wooden chair from his grandfather's house. But sometimes in the dead of night, when the wind is right, Leo will wake from a dream of deep water. He walked downstairs, his feet cold on the floorboards, and he will see it. The seat will be damp, as if someone has just risen from it, and the air around it will carry the faint iron smell of the quarry. He will stand there for a long time, waiting, though he does not know what for. He is the keeper of the empty chair now, the guardian of a story that is only half told, and he knows with a certainty that chills his soul that the thing that wore the name Elias Trant is still out there, and that a chair, after all, is meant to be sat. The writing had stopped. The notebook lay open on his desk, the pen beside it, but the words had dried up weeks ago. Leo found he could no longer shape the sentences, could no longer distinguish between the story he was trying to tell and the reality he was living. The two had bled together, a slow, inevitable seepage. He was no longer a writer observing a mystery. He was a character trapped in the final, interminable chapter. He started leaving the chair offerings. It was not a conscious decision, more an instinct, a primitive gesture of appeasement. A smooth river stone on the seat, a black feather he found on his doorstep, a cup of water, drawn from the tap at midnight, placed on the floor beside it. He would empty the cup in the morning, the water always untouched, yet he felt a compulsion to do it. The rituals were the only things that gave the days any structure, any sense of order against the creeping dread. The town noticed his strangeness. He was the last of the Callahan line, the grandson of the disgraced sheriff, and people gave him a wide berth in the grocery store. Their eyes held not pity, but a wary resentment. He was a living reminder of the thing they all wanted to forget. Children dared each other to run up to his porch and knock, fleeing before he could answer. He never did. One afternoon, sorting through a box of his grandfather's things, he found the photograph. It was the one from the yearbook, but this was the original. A small, square print with deckled edges. On the back, in faded ink, was written, Elias Trant, 14 years old. Leo held it under the lamplight. The boy's eyes were even more unsettling than the original. Less a blur and more a direct, knowing gaze that seemed to cut across the decades. He felt a sudden, vertiginous pull, a sense of falling into those dark pools. That night, the dream was different. There was no water, no crushing pressure. He was simply in his study, and the thing was in the chair. It had no face, no form, but it was undeniably present, a silhouette of absolute stillness. It did not move. It did not speak. It simply existed, occupying the space. and its attention was a physical weight on Leo's skin. He woke not with a gasp, but with a slow, cold certainty. The image of the seated form burned onto the back of his eyelids. The next day, Mrs. Higgins from down the street came to his door, wringing her hands. Her cat, a fat, ancient tabby, was missing. She asked if he'd seen it, her eyes darting past him into the dim hallway. He said he hadn't. But that evening, as he went to place the cup of water by the chair, he saw it. On the floor, directly in front of the chair, was a single wet tabby cat paw print. He did not scream. He did not run. He simply cleaned it up, his hands moving with a detached mechanical efficiency. The line was gone now, completely. The thing was no longer confined to suggestion and memory. It was interacting with his world. It was leaving tokens. The final offering was his own. He doesn't remember deciding to do it. He was standing in his study, the photograph of Elias in his hand, and the compulsion was overwhelming. He walked to the chair. He did not look at the seat, afraid of what he might see. Instead, he placed the photograph carefully on the floor, leaning it against one of the chair's front legs. The boy's eyes now stared out across the room. He went to bed and lay in the dark, listening. The house was silent, a held breath. He must have slept, because he was jolted awake by a sound. It was a small, dry, crinkling sound. He knew what it was instantly. It was the sound of a photograph being picked up. He did not move. He stared at the ceiling, his body rigid. He heard another sound then, a soft, almost inaudible scrape, like a fingernail dragging across wood. It was followed by a long, slow, sighing breath that did not come from his own lungs. It came from the corner of the room. The next morning, the photograph was gone. In its place, on the floorboards where it had been, was a small, dark, wet spot. And the chair was different. It was no longer angled slightly away. It was now turned, perfectly, to face the center of the room. It was waiting. He stopped leaving the offerings. The rituals felt foolish now, the gestures of a child to a god that had finally shown its face. The chair's new position was a command, an unspoken demand for audience. Leo found he could no longer work in his study. The presence was too focused, too patient. He moved his desk into the living room, but the change was useless. The house itself had become an extension of that single waiting space. His sleep became a shallow, fitful thing. He began to hear the dragging steps again, not in his dreams, but in the hallway outside his bedroom door. Step, out, drag, dot, step, I, drag, dot. He would lie frozen, the blankets pulled to his chin, listening as the sound paused outside his room before continuing down the hall, always towards the study. He never opened the door. He knew he would see nothing. The sound was the point. It was a reminder. Courtesy. The town's silence towards him deepened into something more active. He found a dead crow on his porch, its neck broken. A message scrawled in the dust on his truck windshield. Leave Dart. He was no longer just a reminder. He was a beacon. The thing in his house was casting a shadow, and the town, in its primal way, was trying to cut the source of the light. One evening, desperate for a voice, any voice, he called an old professor from college, a man who had studied folklore and the anthropology of fear. He tried to explain, haltingly, about the chair, the history, the feeling of being watched by something that considered him furniture. He left out the deaths. He left out the names. The professor listened patiently, then sighed. "Leo," he said, his voice kind but weary. "What you're describing is a classic folie à plusieurs, a shared psychosis. You've immersed yourself in a local tragedy, a trauma that wasn't yours to begin with. You've internalized the guilt of those old men. This chair, it's a symbol. Your mind is making it a vessel." Leo listened, and for a moment, a beautiful, fleeting moment, he almost believed it. It was a clean academic explanation. It offered a path to sanity, to a world where things made sense. He thanked the professor and hung up. As he lowered the phone, he saw it. A single, perfect trail of wet, dark footprints led from the hallway into the study. They were small, the size of a boy's. They had not been there minutes before. He did not follow them. He simply stood in the center of his living room, the professor's rational words turning to ash in his mind. This was not a symbol. A symbol did not leave physical evidence. A symbol did not breathe in the dark. He was not crazy. He was curated. The final surrender was quiet. He moved the chair. He didn't do it in anger or fear, but with a strange, solemn sense of ceremony. He gripped its wooden back, the wood cold and slightly damp under his palms, and pulled it from the corner. He positioned it in the exact center of the study, facing the doorway. It looked right there. It looked like a throne. He now sleeps on the couch. He uses the back door. He has not entered the study since. But sometimes, from the hallway, he will glance in. The chair is always there, in the center of the room. And sometimes, just for a second, he thinks he can see the faintest impression on the seat. The ghost of a weight that is slowly, patiently, making itself at home. He knows he will never leave Stillwater. The story is not half told. It is only just beginning, and he is the page upon which the next words will be written. He is waiting, just like the chair. The river was the next to speak. It rose in the night, a silent, swelling theft from the banks that no one witnessed. By morning, the lower streets of Stillwater were submerged under a foot of water, coffee brown and shockingly cold. The water did not recede with the dawn. It lingered for days, and when it finally drained away, it left behind a silt that was unnaturally dark and thick, clinging to everything like a shroud. Embedded in the mud on Leah's doorstep was a single waterlogged shoe, a child's size, from a style 50 years out of date. He picked it up. The leather was soft as rotten fruit, the laces brittle. He did not throw it away. He carried it inside, his movements those of a sleepwalker, and placed it on the floor beside the centered chair. It was not an offering. It was an acknowledgement, a returned belonging. His own reflection began to change. Catching his face in a window at twilight, he would see not his own tired eyes, but a paler, younger face superimposed over his own. The eyes in that other face were dark and placid, like the water at the bottom of the quarry. The image would last only a second, but the feeling of displacement lingered for hours. He was being worn away, his identity sanded down to make room for another. He started reading the old town ledgers in the library, not for answers anymore, but for a way to map the thing's influence. He found the record of Elias Trant's family. They had left Stillwater a month after his disappearance, their house sold for pennies. The trail ended there, but on a hunch, a pull he felt in his gut, he looked up the quarry's history. It had not always been a quarry. Before the limestone was discovered, the land had a different name. The locals called it the Drowning Place. An old Wabanaki legend, hastily recorded by a missionary in the 1700s, spoke of a spirit that inhabited the deep, still pools of the region, a being that was not good or evil, but terribly lonely. It would sometimes take a child, the story said, not to kill them, but to keep their form for a while, to have a voice. It would wear them until they broke, and then it would return to the water to wait. Leo closed the book. He felt no triumph of discovery, only a profound, settling horror. The boys had not just killed a boy. They had released something that had been trapped in a human shape. They had untied it, and it had simply been trying to get back to the place it felt was its own. The chair in his study was not a piece of furniture. It was an anchor. That night, the dream was the most vivid yet. He was standing in his study, and the thing was in the chair, its form still indistinct. A man-shaped void. But this time, it moved. A hand, gray and shimmering as if seen through water, rose and pointed not at Leo, but at the space beside him. Leo turned his head. Standing next to him was his grandfather, Frank, not as an old man, but as the teenage boy he had been on that long-ago day. Frank's face was a mask of terror. He was shaking his head, mouthing the word no. The thing in the chair did not react. It simply kept pointing, its silence more terrible than any curse. Leo woke with a start. The image of his young, doomed grandfather seared into his mind. He understood then the true nature of the haunting. It was not just about the chair, or the quarry, or even Elias. It was a loop, a moment of violence caught in an endless replay, and he was now inside it. He was both audience and participant. He got up and walked to the study doorway. The chair sat in the center of the room, stark in the moonlight. It was no longer empty. The air above the seat shimmered like heat haze on a summer road. He could feel its attention fix on him, a cold spotlight. It was waiting for him to speak, to act, to take his place in the story. He knew what he had to do. It was the only move left. He would not bring it another offering. He would not run. He would complete the circle. He would give it the one thing it seemed to want most, the thing it had been patiently, inexorably pulling from the world and from his own mind. He would give it a voice. He took a step into the room. The temperature dropped sharply. His breath plumed in the air. He looked at the shimmering space in the chair, and he began to speak the only words that felt true, the words that had started it all. "It was us," he whispered, his voice cracking. "We killed him." The shimmering in the chair solidified. For the first time, he saw it clearly. It was the boy from the photograph, Elias Trant. But his eyes were the color of the deep quarry water, and he was smiling. The smile was not a human expression. It was a crack in the world, a rend in the fabric of things that showed the endless, patient dark beneath. The boy's form wavered, not like a mirage, but like something seen through deep, disturbed water. Leo felt the confession hang in the air between them, a key turning in a lock he had spent his whole life trying to keep closed. The thing that wore Elias did not speak. It had no need. The words Leo had given it were its own now, a truth it could finally wear. It lifted a hand, the gesture slow and deliberate, and pointed at the empty space on the floor directly in front of the chair. Leo's body moved without his conscious command. His legs, heavy and numb, carried him forward. He knelt. The floorboards were icy against his knees, and the smell of the quarry, of wet stone and deep, still water, was so thick he could taste it. He bowed his head, not in prayer, but in submission. He was the final piece, the last witness. The story required an ending. He felt a cold pressure on the crown of his head, light as a resting hand. It was not the weight of a physical thing, but the weight of a history, of a secret kept for 50 years. It was the weight of the water at the bottom of the quarry. He closed his eyes, waiting for the end, for the cold water to fill his lungs as it had filled the others. It did not come. The pressure lifted. The crushing cold in the room began to recede, not in a rush, but in a slow, steady ebb, like a tide going out. The smell of the quarry faded, leaving only the dusty, familiar scent of his own house. He stayed on his knees for a long time, his muscles locked, afraid to break the spell. When he finally looked up, the chair was empty, truly empty. The shimmering presence was gone. The room was just a room again. Moonlight fell through the window in a clean, pale square. He was alone. He did not feel relief. He felt a different kind of emptiness, a hollowed-out silence where the dread had lived for so long. He stood, his joints aching, and looked at the chair. It was just a simple wooden chair. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the seat. It was dry. In the days that followed, the town began to change. The oppressive silence lifted. The river stayed within its banks. The children no longer dared each other to approach Leo's house, not out of fear, but because the strange pull was gone. The story, it seemed, was over. Leo knew better. He sat in his living room, watching the dust motes dance in the sunlight, and he understood the nature of the bargain. The haunting was over, but the memory was now a part of him, a scar on his soul. He had given the thing what it needed, and in return, it had left him with the burden of its truth. He was the keeper of the story now, not as a guardian, but as a living record. And he knew, with a certainty that was both terrible and peaceful, that the thing from the drowning place was still out there, wearing a boy's smile, and that it was no longer lonely. It had a voice, and it was only a matter of time before it decided to use it again, somewhere else. He started walking by the river every day. It was no longer a place of dread, but of quiet contemplation. The water flowed, brown and ordinary, and he would watch it for hours, thinking of the deep, still pools that had birthed the legend. He was no longer afraid of seeing a face in the water. He had already seen it. Mrs. Higgins got a new cat, a skittish little thing that darted under her porch whenever Leo passed. She no longer looked at him with fear, but with a kind of puzzled curiosity, as if trying to remember why she had ever been afraid of him in the first place. The story was receding from the town's collective mind, leaving only a vague unease, a half-remembered dream. He kept the chair. He moved it back to its original corner in the study, and sometimes he would sit in it. The wood was just wood. The room was just a room, but he could feel the echo of the presence, not as a threat, but as a reminder of the transaction that had taken place. He had traded his peace for the town's, and in doing so, he had found a different kind of peace, one forged in the acceptance of a terrible truth. One afternoon, a letter arrived with no return address. The postmark was from a small town in Oregon he had never heard of. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank except for a single sentence typed in the center. It said, "Thank you for the story." Leo felt a chill, but it was a distant thing, like a memory of cold. He folded the letter and placed it in a box with the river stone and the black feather. He did not wonder how it had found him. He knew that stories have a way of traveling, and that some voices, once given, can never be completely silenced. He went to the window and looked out at the quiet street. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. It was a beautiful evening in Stillwater. He stood there for a long time, waiting, though he did not know for what. He was simply listening. The listening became his new habit. He no longer jumped at creaks in the floorboards or the wind in the eaves. Instead, he listened for the quality of the silence, testing it for depth, for the particular resonance that suggested it was being shared. He found himself listening to the conversations of strangers in the grocery store, not for the words, but for the cadence, for any hint of a story that didn't quite belong to the person telling it. He started writing. It began as simple notes, a way to document the events, but it quickly grew into something else. He wrote about the chair, the quarry, the boys his grandfather had called friends. He wrote about the weight of the confession and the emptiness that followed. He wrote about the letter. He filled notebooks with a script that grew increasingly frantic, as if he were trying to pour the entire experience out of himself and onto the page. He was not writing for an audience. He was writing to the presence, a one-sided correspondence with a listener he knew was still out there. Months passed. The leaves turned and fell, and a hard frost settled over Stillwater. On the first truly cold night, he built a fire in the living room hearth and sat before it, one of his filled notebooks in his lap. The flames danced, casting long, wavering shadows that reminded him of things he tried to forget. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to burn the book, to let the story turn to ash and be carried up the chimney, released into the night air. As he held the notebook over the flames, a sound stopped him. It was a soft, wet pattering like rain, but it was not coming from the roof. It was coming from the hallway. He lowered the book and turned his head. The sound was familiar. It was the sound of small, bare, wet feet on hardwood. He did not move. He watched the doorway. The pattering stopped just beyond the threshold, in the dark of the hall. He could see nothing, but he could feel a gaze upon him, cool and appraising. It was the same as before. There was no menace, no demanding weight. This was different. This was an acknowledgement. A single perfect wet footprint appeared on the floorboards just inside the living room. Then, another. A few inches closer. They were not leading toward him. They were leading toward the fire. He watched, his breath caught in his throat as the invisible feet left a trail to the hearth. A log in the fire shifted, collapsing in a shower of sparks. For a single heart-stopping moment, the firelight seemed to outline a small, shimmering form, hunched before the flames as if to warm itself. Then, it was gone. The footprints began to dry, fading from a dark, wet brown to a faint, damp outline on the wood. The presence had departed. It had not come for him. It had only come to listen to the crackling of the fire, to feel its heat, to share a moment in the quiet house. Leo looked down at the notebook in his hands. He understood then that the story was not his to burn. It was a shared thing now, a thread that connected him to something vast and old and lonely. He closed the book and held it to his chest. He would keep writing. He would keep listening. The story was over, but the telling of it had just begun. And he had been chosen, not as a victim, but as its scribe. The quiet in the house was no longer a held breath. It was the quiet of a companionable silence. He was not alone. Story 4. The first thing I noticed was the smell of wet stones. It came on a Tuesday in late September, a cold mineral dampness that bloomed in the center of our kitchen, a place that usually smelled of baking bread and the lemony polish my wife, Clara, used on the oak cabinets. It was an ancient smell, the breath of a deep well or a cave sealed for 1,000 years. And it felt like a violation. I remember standing by the sink, a glass of water halfway to my lips, and feeling the hair on my arms rise. I said nothing to Clara, who was humming over a pot of simmering tomato sauce, her pregnant belly a perfect warm globe under her apron. To name it would be to make it real, and our reality was one of bright, bustling normalcy, a fortress against the world's chaos. We had built it, brick by brick, with love and sheer force of will. Our house was a symphony of life, a grand, slightly shabby Victorian at the end of a cul-de-sac, painted a cheerful, fading yellow. It was filled with the glorious noise of our 4 children. Michael, the eldest at 10, all scraped knees and earnest questions about the universe. Then the twins, Sarah and Eleanor, 8 years old, a whirlwind of whispered secrets and shared laughter. And little Thomas, just 4, who still carried the soft, milky scent of babyhood in his hair. We were a portrait, a living, breathing advertisement for the abundance of a chosen life. Clara was the sun at the center of it all, her love a tangible force that warmed every room. I, Arthur, was the grateful orbit, the provider, the father whose chest swelled with a pride so profound it sometimes felt like a physical ache. The wet stone smell came and went over the following weeks, a ghost in our home. I would catch it on the stairs, in the hallway outside the nursery we were preparing. A quick, cold pocket of air that vanished when I turned my head. Clara claimed she never smelled it, patting my cheek and saying I was working too hard. But I saw the way she would sometimes pause, her hand resting on the new life kicking within her, a faint line appearing between her brows before she shook it away and returned to folding tiny sleepers. Franco was born on a night when the rain fell not in drops but in sheets, a solid wall of water that beat against the hospital windows. The labor was different, Clara would later whisper to me in the dark. her voice thin with a fear she dared not show by daylight. It was not the powerful, productive pain of the others, but a clenching, resistant agony, as if her own body were trying to reject the process. When he finally came, there was no triumphant cry, only a silence that stretched too long, followed by a thin, reedy sound that was less a wail and more a vibration, the hum of a taut wire. He was a small thing, with a fuzz of black hair and eyes that were not the hazy blue of a newborn, but a dark, liquid obsidian. They did not seem to unfocus, but to take in the world with a chilling, preternatural awareness. The nurses commented on how quiet he was, how still. He did not root or fuss. He simply observed. The whetstone smell clung to him, a faint aura that no amount of washing could erase. We brought him home, and the symphony of our house began to falter, one instrument at a time. It started with the animals. Our old golden retriever, Barnaby, who had welcomed each new child with a gentle lick, would not enter the nursery. He would stand at the threshold, his body trembling, a low whine building in his throat before he would turn and slink away. The cat, a placid tabby, simply vanished one day and never returned. Then it was the children. Michael, who had been so eager to hold his new brother, grew quiet and withdrawn after the first time. He said nothing, but I found him later, scrubbing his hands at the kitchen sink until the skin was raw. The twins, who had been a single chattering entity, began to fracture. They argued over trivial things, their voices sharp and brittle. Their shared room, once a haven of giggling conspiracy, became a battleground of hissed accusations and slammed doors. Little Thomas took to sucking his thumb again, a habit he'd broken a year before. He would sit in the corner of the living room, watching the world with wide, wounded eyes, flinching at sudden noises. Franco himself did not cry. He did not coo or babble. He was a vessel of silence and stillness. He would lie in his crib for hours, his dark eyes open, fixed on the mobile of painted stars that spun lazily above him. He did not reach for toys. He did not startle at loud sounds. He ate with a slow, mechanical efficiency that was deeply unnerving. When you held him, his body did not mold to yours. He remained rigid, a small, dense weight that seemed to pull the warmth from your own flesh. Clara fought against the creeping dread with a ferocity that was both magnificent and terrible to behold. She smothered Franco in a torrent of forced normalcy, singing brightly off-key lullabies, clapping his tiny hands together in patty cake, her voice a little too loud, her smile a little too wide. She was a lighthouse keeper desperately polishing the lens as the storm gathered force around her. But at night, in our bed, I could feel the tension thrumming through her body. She stopped asking me if I noticed things. We both knew. The first Christmas after Franco's birth was a grim pantomime. My parents and Clara's sister, Beth, came for dinner. The house was decorated. The tree glittered. The table groaned with food, but the air was thick with the unspoken. The whetstone smell was stronger than ever, a cold anchor in the warm, spiced air. Franco, nearly 6 months old, sat propped in a high chair. He did not look at the twinkling lights or reach for the shiny wrapping paper. He watched us. He watched my father carve the turkey, his dark eyes following the motion of the knife with an unsettling intensity. My mother, usually a font of grandmotherly doting, could barely bring herself to touch him. "He's very quiet, isn't he?" she said, her voice strained. Beth, ever the pragmatist, was less diplomatic. She pulled me aside in the kitchen, her face grim. "Arthur, there's something wrong with that child," she whispered, her breath smelling of gin and regret. "It's not right. The way he looks at you. It's not natural." A hot spike of defensive anger shot through me. "He's just different, Beth. He's our son." Different? She scoffed, her voice a low hiss. Arthur, that thing in there is not a child. It's a changeling. It's a stone that fell out of the sky and learned to wear a baby's skin. I told her to leave. The silence that descended after her car pulled away was heavier than any argument. We went through the motions of gift-giving, but the joy had been leached from the room. The children opened their presents with a listless apathy. Later, I found Michael standing over Franco's crib, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. "He's breaking us," Michael said, his voice trembling with a confusion beyond his years. "He's making everyone mean and sad." I wanted to gather him up, to tell him it wasn't true, that love would see us through, but the words turned to dust in my mouth. I just stood there, a sentinel at a post he no longer understood, watching my firstborn son stare down at my fifth with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. The years did not soften Franco, they calcified him. He learned to walk, but his gait was a stiff, deliberate shuffle, as if he were navigating a surface he distrusted. He never spoke a word. He would sometimes make sounds, a dry, rattling click in the back of his throat that made the skin on your neck crawl. He was drawn to cold, hard things. We would find him in the basement, sitting perfectly still on the concrete floor, his small hand pressed against the granite foundation of the house. He would stay there for hours, a small, dark statue in the gloom. Our family became an island. Birthday parties went uninvited. Playdates became a thing of the past. The other children on the street, once a constant stream of noise and energy in our yard, now gave our house a wide berth, as if it were quarantine. The perfect yellow paint began to peel. The vibrant flower beds Clara had once tended with such love grew wild and choked with weeds. The house itself seemed to be sighing, sinking under a great weight. The climax came on a night of howling wind, a night that felt ripped from the pages of a darker story than the one we had tried to live. Franco was 7. The tension in the house had reached a breaking point. Sarah and Eleanor, now teenagers, were locked in a cold war of silence. Thomas had become a ghost, spending all his time in his room with headphones on. Michael, at 17, was a simmering pot of rage, his every interaction with us a barely contained snarl. It was Michael who finally broke. He had come home late, the smell of cheap beer on his breath, his eyes wild with a pain I could only guess at. He stood in the living room, his tall frame trembling, and pointed a shaking finger at Franco, who was sitting in his usual spot on the floor, not playing, just sitting. "Get it out," Michael slurred, his voice cracking. "Get it out of this house. It's not my brother. It's a curse. It's a thing you brought into this house and it's killing us. It's killing Mom. Look at her." Clara was weeping silently on the sofa, her face buried in her hands. She was a skeleton of the woman she had been, her vibrancy extinguished, her love worn down to a nub of exhausted duty. "Michael, that's enough," I said, my voice hollow. "No, it's not enough. It will never be enough until it's gone." He lunged towards Franco. What happened next is a blur of sensation. A series of images burned into my mind. I moved to intercept him. The wind shrieked like a banshee outside. A lamp shattered. And in the chaos, Franco looked up. He did not look scared. He did not look angry. He looked at Michael, at me, at his weeping mother. And for the first time, his expression was not one of blank observation, but of something else. It was a look of ancient, cosmic understanding, a weary, profound comprehension of the pathetic, flailing tragedy of our lives. And in that look I saw everything. I saw the vast, cold indifference of the universe, the meaningless collision of atoms that had somehow produced love and family. And this unbearable pain. I saw that Franco was not a monster. He was a mirror. He was a still, dark pool reflecting back the absolute fragility of our own constructed world, and the terrible hidden fault lines that had always existed beneath the surface of our happiness. Michael froze, his rage dissolving into a whimper of pure existential terror. He backed away, turned, and fled out the front door into the storm. We heard his car peel away, the sound swallowed by the wind. The next morning, the storm had passed. The house was preternaturally quiet. Michael was gone. He had driven to Beth's house, and he never lived with us again. The fight had broken the last of the spell, not by resolving anything, but by revealing the unbridgeable chasm that now separated us. We did not get rid of Franco. How could we? He was our son. He was our burden. He was our truth. The years ground on. The other children grew up and left, one by one. Their goodbyes quiet and final, their relief a palpable thing. They called on birthdays and holidays, their voices careful and distant from their own normal lives in normal houses. Clara and I were left alone in the big, silent yellow house with Franco. We grew old around him. He required little. He ate what was put in front of him. He never aged, not in any way that mattered. He remained a boy of 7, then 17, then 27 in body, but his eyes held the same ancient, watchful stillness. The wet stone smell became the permanent atmosphere of our home, the smell of our lives. Clara died last autumn. She simply went to sleep one night and did not wake up. I found her lying beside me, her face finally, blessedly at peace. I thought her death would shatter me, but a strange calm had settled over me years before. I had made my choice. I had chosen this life, this love, this anchor. Now it is just the two of us. Me, an old man with papery skin and trembling hands, and Franco, my ageless son. He sits in his chair by the window, looking out at the overgrown garden, the rusting swing set, the world that passed us by. He does not help me. He does not comfort me. He simply is. This morning I made my slow way down to the kitchen to put the kettle on. The house was cold. The silence was absolute. I stood at the sink, looking out at the gray dawn, and I realized something. The smell was gone. The pervasive, cold, mineral dampness that had haunted us for over 30 years had simply vanished. The air was just air, stale and dust-filled, but clean. I turned, my heart thumping a slow, painful rhythm in my chest. I shuffled back into the living room. Franco was still in his chair, but he was different. He was looking at me, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in his dark eyes. Not love, not recognition. It was a question, a profound and terrible confusion. The essence that had been Franco, the still dark mirror, was receding. The intelligence that had held him in its grip was departing, leaving behind the empty vessel of a man. I walked over to him, my joints complaining. I placed my hand on his shoulder. It felt like a shoulder, just bone and flesh and cloth. The terrifying otherness was draining away like water down a deep, dark drain. He looked up at me, and his lips parted. A small, dry sound emerged. Not a click, but a whisper of air. "Father?" The word hung in the room, devoid of emotion, a label without meaning. I did not feel joy. I did not feel relief. I felt a loss so colossal it had no name. The horror was not his presence. The horror was his absence. The terrible purpose that had defined my life, the weight I had carried for decades, was simply gone. I sank into the chair opposite him. We sat there together, two men in a silent, dusty room. The sun rose higher, casting a weak, yellow light on the floorboards. Outside, a bird began to sing. The house was still. The world was still, and as I looked at my son, who was now just a man, I understood the most frightening thing of all. The storm was over. The long, strange night had passed, and in the quiet, featureless dawn that remained, there was nothing left to be afraid of. Nothing at all. The days that followed were a slow unraveling. Franco, or the man who had been Franco, began to deteriorate. It was a subtle but relentless process. He forgot how to walk. I would find him on the floor, his limbs arranged awkwardly, a look of mild surprise on his face. Then he forgot how to feed himself. I had to spoon thin porridge into his mouth, and he would swallow with a mechanical reflex, his eyes vacant. The dark, knowing intelligence was gone, replaced by a profound and empty simplicity. He was like a complex piece of clockwork whose mainspring had finally snapped, the gears winding down to a final, silent halt. I cared for him. It was the last duty I had, the final brick in the fortress of my life. I bathed his limp body, changed his clothes, and guided him back to his chair when he tried to stand and crumpled. He was heavy, and my old bones protested, but the routine gave shape to the endless, quiet days. The house no longer felt haunted. It felt posthumous, as if we were both living in the time after our own story had ended. One afternoon, I was reading the newspaper aloud, a habit from a lifetime ago, my voice a dry rustle in the stillness. I looked over at him. His head had lolled to the side, and a thin line of drool traced a path from his lip to his chin. His breathing was shallow. I set the paper down. I knew. I called the doctor, not out of hope, but out of a sense of procedure. The young doctor who came was polite and efficient. He pronounced Franco dead, citing a vague and general failure of the system. He asked me questions about his medical history, and I gave vague answers. What not did I? Murió mia. Messi Yesu Guaya. Royce. I'm going to say that my son had been inhabited by a silent presence for 30 years, and that it had left. He would have nodded, written something down, and prescribed me medication. After the body was taken away, the silence in the house deepened. It was no longer a waiting silence, but a conclusive one. I walked from room to room, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. I stopped in the nursery, now a storage room for boxes of forgotten things. I stood in the doorway of the room Sarah and Eleanor had shared, the faded ghost of an old argument still clinging to the air. I ended up in the living room, in my chair. The following week, a woman from the city came. She was kind, with a soft voice and a clipboard. She talked about assisted living facilities, about communities where I would have people my own age to talk to. I nodded and smiled and took the brochures. After she left, I placed them neatly in the fireplace and watched the cheerful colors blacken and curl into ash. I will not be leaving this house. This is where I built my life. This is where I loved my wife and raised my children. This is where I tended to my strange son. This is where the story happened. To leave would be to admit that the story is over, and I am not yet ready for that. The memories, even the painful ones, are the furniture of my soul. I would rather sit among them in the dust and the quiet than in a bright, clean room with no history at all. Sometimes, I think I hear the ghost of a sound, the clatter of Michael's shoes on the stairs, the twins' laughter from the garden, Clara humming in the kitchen. But it is only the house settling, or the wind in the eaves. I do not mind. They are good ghosts. They remind me that it was all real, that the love was real, even if it was not enough to save us. And in the long, quiet afternoons, as the light fades from the window, that feels like enough. It has to be. The mail still comes, of course. Bills and flyers, and the occasional letter from one of the children. They are not children anymore. They have children of their own. Their letters are careful. filled with news of soccer games and school plays, a world of bright, normal concerns. They ask if I am eating, if I need anything. They do not ask about Franco. They think his passing has freed me. They cannot understand that the cage door was opened, and I no longer had the will to fly out. Today, a letter came from Michael. It was thicker than usual. Inside was a photograph of his family, all of them smiling on a beach somewhere, in a long, careful letter. He wrote about his work, his wife, his son's acceptance to college. The words were ordinary, but I could read the subtext beneath them. The long, slow process of forgiveness. He ended the letter with an invitation. He wants me to come live with him. He has a guest room, he says. It has a nice view of the mountains. I held the photograph for a long time, tracing the lines of my grandson's face, seeing the echo of my own son in his smile. A part of me, the part that is still a father, felt a dim warmth, but it was a distant thing, like a star seen from the bottom of a well. I folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. I will not go. This house is my skin. To leave it would be a kind of flaying. The silence here is my companion now. It is not the hostile silence of Franco's presence, but the quiet of a library long after the readers have gone home. It is a place of accumulated stories, and I am the last volume on the shelf. I make tea in the quiet kitchen. I sit in my chair. The other chair is empty, and the emptiness is no longer a judgment. It is just a fact. The dust motes dance in a shaft of sunlight, and for a moment, I can almost feel Clara's hand on my shoulder. It is a memory, but it is a solid one. It is the truth I have chosen. This is the piece that remains, not a happy piece, but a deep and final one, like a stone that has reached the bottom of a very deep lake. The seasons turned. The maple in the front yard, which Clara had planted as a sapling, shed its last crimson leaf. Winter sealed the house in a new kind of silence, one of early nights and frost on the window panes. I stopped bothering with the furnace much, letting the cold seep in. It felt honest. The chill was outside now, where it belonged, not a presence in the room with me. I found myself talking to Clara more often. Not out loud, but in my mind. I would tell her about the squirrel that raided the bird feeder, about the way the lad hit the mantelpiece in the afternoon. Mundane things, the kind of things we would have shared over dinner. It was not a conversation, but it was a thread, a way of keeping her near. I knew it was the fancy of an old man, but it was a comfort nonetheless. One Tuesday, the doorbell rang. It was a sound so foreign it seemed to shock the very air. I opened the door to find a young couple standing on the porch. They were bright-eyed and hopeful, holding a packet of papers. They were from a historical society, they said. They were researching houses from the early 20th century in the area and were fascinated by ours. They asked if they could see the original woodwork. I let them in. They moved through the rooms with a reverent excitement, pointing out the crown molding, the built-in bookshelves, the fireplace tile. They did not see the scars or the silence. They saw a structure, a piece of history. The woman exclaimed over the view from the living room window, the same window Franco had sat before for decades. She saw the overgrown garden as charmingly rustic. As they were leaving, the man turned to me. "It's a wonderful house," he said, "full of character. You can feel the lives that have been lived here." I simply nodded. They left, their energy fading from the hallway like a scent. I locked the door and returned to my chair. The house felt different after they left. Not better, not worse, but their words had shifted something. They had seen a monument. I had been living in a tomb. That night I did not dream of the past. I did not dream at all. I woke in the early hours before dawn, the darkness absolute. And for the first time since Clara died, since Franco left, I felt not peace, but a simple, profound loneliness. It was not a sharp pain, but a vast, empty plane. I was a single point of awareness in a silent, sleeping world. I got up and made my way to the kitchen. I did not turn on the light. I stood at the sink, looking out at the blackness. And then, a single, clear thought formed in my mind. It was time to write the letter. Not a letter of acceptance, but one of my own. I would write to Michael. I would tell him I could not come, but that he could. He could come here, to this house. He could bring his family. He could let his grandson, my great-grandson, run in the overgrown garden. He could fill these rooms with noise and life again. The story was over for me, but the house, this beautiful, terrible, enduring house, could have a new one. The idea did not bring me joy, but it felt right. It felt like the next and final page. The sky began to lighten from black to deep blue. I took a pen and a sheet of paper from the drawer. My hand did not tremble as I began to write. "Dear Michael," I started. The words came slowly, but they came. Outside, the world was stirring, and for the first time in a very long time, I found I was curious to see what the day would bring. The letter was short. I did not explain my reasons, knowing he would not understand them. I simply stated that the house was his if he wanted it, that it should stay in the family. I told him there were no conditions, only that he should come see it once before deciding. I signed it with "Love, your father," and sealed the envelope. The act felt monumental, the lifting of a weight I had not known I was still carrying. I mailed it the next day, walking the few blocks to the post office on legs that felt strangely light. The air was crisp, and I noticed the tight buds on the trees, a promise of spring I had been ignoring for years. The world was continuing. The thought was neither happy nor sad. It was merely true. Weeks passed. I did not hear from Michael. I did not expect an immediate reply. He would need to talk to his wife, to his son. They would have to consider the practicality of it, the weight of such an inheritance. I went about my days as usual, but the waiting was different now. It was not the passive waiting for an end, but an active waiting for a response. I found myself cleaning a little. Not a deep clean, but a tidying. I cleared the dust from the mantelpiece. I threw out yellowed newspapers. It was not for them, but for myself. A way to put things in order. One afternoon, I was in the attic, looking for an old photograph of the house Clara had always liked, when I found the box. It was tucked behind an old trunk, a simple cardboard box labeled Franco's Things in Clara's neat handwriting. My breath caught. I had forgotten it existed. I carried it down to the living room, my heart a dull, heavy drum. I sat on the floor and opened it. Inside were the artifacts of a life that never was. A small, worn teddy bear, a set of wooden blocks, a few crayon drawings, not the strange, intricate patterns of his later years, but the simple, wobbly circles and stick figures of a very young child. The child he had been before. I held the teddy bear, its fur matted and thin. It smelled of nothing but attic dust. There was no trace of the cold stone, no echo of the presence. It was just a box of old toys. I did not weep. I felt a quiet, settled sadness. The final grain of sand falling in an hourglass. This was all that remained of the son we had lost. Not the mysterious being, not the silent mirror, but a boy who had once clutched a teddy bear. I closed the box and placed it back in the attic. It belonged to the past. The future was a different question, one that was now traveling through the mail, heading toward my eldest son. I went back to my chair by the window. The sun was warm on my face. I had closed my eyes, and for the first time in decades, I did not think of what had been. I thought of what might be. The sound of a child's laughter in the garden, the smell of a meal cooking in the kitchen, the gentle chaos of a family living within these walls. It was a faint hope, a distant possibility, but it was there. And for now, that was sufficient. The reply came on a Saturday. It was not a letter, but a phone call. Michael's voice was careful, measured. He thanked me for my offer. He said he and Susan had talked about it at length. They were settled, he explained. Their lives were on the other side of the country. Uprooting their son in his last year of high school would be difficult. The house, he gently suggested, was too much for them. He asked if I would consider selling it and using the money to find a more comfortable place for myself. I listened, my hand tight on the receiver. I told him I understood. I told him not to worry about me. We exchanged a few more pleasantries, and then the call was over. The silence in the house rushed back in, but it was a different silence now. It was not the silence of waiting, but of a final, closed door. I walked through the rooms one more time. I saw them not with my own memories, but with Michael's practical eyes. The outdated wiring, the old plumbing, the sheer size of it. He was right. It was too much. It was a relic. The history it held was mine alone, a language no one else could speak. The following week, I called a real estate agent. A brisk, friendly woman named Janet arrived. She walked through the house, clicking her tongue at the potential. She talked about open floor plans and curb appeal. She did not feel the lives lived here. She saw square footage and original hardwood. She planted a sign on the front lawn, a bright, cheerful slash of red in the overgrown grass. People started to come, couples with loud voices and measuring tapes. They peered into closets and knocked on walls. They talked about knocking down the wall between the kitchen and the living room to create a great room. They called the nursery a small bedroom. They saw a project, a blank slate. I sat in my chair during these invasions, a ghost in my own home. One young couple, particularly earnest, asked me what I loved most about the house. I looked at them, their faces open and expectant. I thought of telling them about Clara's garden, about the sound of my children's footsteps on the stairs, about the decades I spent watching my son in this very room. But I just smiled and said, "The light is nice in the afternoons." They nodded, satisfied, and moved on to discuss the water pressure. The offers began to trickle in. They were numbers on a page, meaningless to me. Janet was excited by one in particular, a full-price offer from a family who wanted to restore it to its former glory. I signed the papers without reading them. The transaction was swift, impersonal. The house was no longer mine. My last day in the house was a bright, cool day in early spring. I had packed a single suitcase. The rest I had left for the estate sale people to deal with. I walked through the empty rooms. The echoes were gone now, stripped away by the emptiness. It was just a shell. I stood in the living room for a long time, looking at the patch of faded wallpaper where Franco's chair had been. There was nothing left to feel. I closed the front door for the last time and turned the key in the lock. I did not look back as I walked down the path to the waiting taxi. I was going to a small, clean apartment in a building for seniors, a place Michael had helped me find. It had a nice view of a courtyard. It was a place with no history, no ghosts. As the car pulled away from the curb, I felt the last thread tying me to my life gently snap. I was untethered. A balloon released into a blank, blue sky. I leaned my head against the window and watched the world go by, a stranger to everything, most of all to myself. The apartment was exactly as the brochure had promised. It was beige and quiet. The walls were thin, but my neighbors were quiet too, their lives a muffled television mumble, a distant flush of a toilet. I unpacked my single suitcase. I placed a photograph of Clara on the bedside table. I put my clothes in the small, empty dresser. The task took less than an hour. Then I sat in a single armchair by the window and looked out at the courtyard. A man I did not know was watering a patch of petunias. Days began to pass in a featureless procession. I ate my meals in the communal dining hall, nodding at the other residents, making polite, meaningless conversation. They talked about their grandchildren, their ailments, the quality of the food. I listened and smiled, and offered nothing in return. My life had been reduced to a series of small, manageable events. A doctor's appointment, a trip to the library, the arrival of the mail. I had thought the move would be a severance, a clean break, but I had been wrong. The house had not been the cage. I had carried its emptiness with me. Here, in this bright, safe, sanitized place, the silence was absolute. There were no ghosts to keep me company. No floorboards that creaked under Michael's feet. No window that caught the afternoon light just so for Clara. There was only the hum of the refrigerator and the distant, hollow sound of a life being lived correctly. One evening, I was looking through a magazine when my hand froze. There was a picture, a small black and white photo in a real estate section featuring historic homes. It was my house. The caption listed the new owners and described the meticulous restoration. They had painted the exterior a different color, a deep charcoal gray. Clara had always loved the white. I dropped the magazine as if it had burned me. I went to bed early, but sleep would not come. I lay in the dark, and the memories did not come as they usually did, as gentle, melancholic visitors. They came as a torrent. I remembered the day we moved in, Clara pregnant with Michael, her face flushed with excitement. I remembered teaching Sarah to ride a bike on the front path, her braids flying. I remembered the crushing weight of Franco's body as I guided him back to his chair. I remembered the exact sound of the back door slamming when Eleanor left for the last time. I remembered it all, not as a story that had ended, but as a current. A river of love and pain that was still flowing, and I had stepped out of it. I got out of bed. I did not turn on the light. I stood at the window and looked out at the dark courtyard, and I knew with a certainty that was as solid as the floor beneath my feet that I had made a mistake, a profound and irrevocable error. I had confused the end of my story with the end of my life. The story was all I had. The pain was part of it. The silence was part of it. The love, most of all, was part of it. By leaving, I had not preserved the memory. I had abandoned it. I had left my soul in that house, and I had come here, to this beige room, to wait. Thank you for making it all the way to the end and for joining me on another journey through our nighttime scary stories. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next tales, and to help our channel grow. Wishing you a calm, peaceful good night, and I'll see you tomorrow with a brand new story.